Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
Hello, Jackson. I didn't feel anything at all, nothing at all. I thought it would be like everyone says. But time will stop, or I'd suddenly experience something that would tell me tragedy had struck. But no, nothing. I spent all day at work as they called an ambulance and tried to resuscitate him. I drank tea and a sandwich, and as they wheeled him into the hospital, I was getting ready for work. The radio was playing. He was dying. I was listening to music. Jackson shook his head and lowered his arms. They sat at a large table in the living room. Jackson's fiancée, Ashley, was a beautiful, tall, brown girl with naturally luminous hair that fell in small curls over her shoulders. Ashley was the kind of girl who couldn't sympathize. But in a situation like this, even she knew she had to be supportive. "I'm sorry," she said, but Ashley said the comforting words coldly and blankly. Jackson only sighed in response. She'd never supported him, as if she'd kept to herself, as if she didn't care. She was, in fact, his fiancée. I got the call at 11:34. He died on the way to the hospital. They tried to resuscitate him, but no luck. It was his heart. They said it happens at his age with his illnesses. Dad never took care of his health, never even got a fluoroscopy, he told Ashley, studying her manicure. For a second, Jackson wanted to scream. She's just sitting there looking at her nails. His father had died, not a stranger. He was supposed to be her father-in-law in 3 months. But why is she so indifferent? "Tomorrow," Jackson replied calmly. "You can't demand of a man what is not in him." Well, I guess she is. The funeral took place on an ordinary rainy Tuesday. The autopsy was done quickly as Jackson had requested. He couldn't bear to put it off. He just wanted it to be over quickly. It was incredibly hard on him. The weather had been crying all day. April's icy wind with rain made everyone present shiver. "He's about to wave to us and everyone will get soaked," Jackson said, while saying goodbye to Yvonne's father, John Smith. "He's not cold anymore," he added. Jackson wanted to hug his father, but he knew he didn't need to. The horror of what was happening was tearing him up inside. At that moment, the lid of the coffin, the sound of the hammers, blessings, the plunge into the pit, and the handful of earth. No sound in the world was as terrifying as the sound of earth falling on the coffin lid of a loved one. Everyone was crying. Ashley was the only one standing there with a sad face, lips pressed. Jackson even thought she'd been looking at her nails again for a moment. She was there, accepting condolences, keeping her cool, but she wasn't crying. It was as if what had happened hadn't affected her in any way. She picked out the casket with the same indifferent expression on her face as she would pick out a yogurt at the store. After the funeral, Jackson locked himself in his father's study and didn't leave for almost 24 hours. Without him, the room felt empty, like she was dead too. How many times had they sat in that very office talking, discussing company business? At what point had their last conversation taken place? And what was the last thing he had said to his father? Jackson couldn't remember it now. A few days later, a lawyer came to see him. A tall, statuesque brunette entered the house with him. She looked like a Hollywood actress. Jackson's stepmother was well into her 40s, but she looked 30 at most. It was genetics. Veronica was insanely beautiful, sophisticated with an even matted tan, black eyebrows. She was groomed from head to toe while baking pies and making Ivan anything he asked for. At first, when they'd first gotten together, Jackson had thought it was just another of his father's flings, of which there had been plenty. After his mom died, Jackson's dad had been alone for 10 years, unable to look at any woman. He loved his first wife very much and was faithful to her. But one day, it was like something clicked inside and he changed. One affair after another. It must have been a midlife crisis. Ivan became known as a womanizer who only wanted one thing from women. Veronica was something else entirely. When Ivan met her, he had to learn how to buy flowers and jewelry. After all, she was a gorgeous, self-sufficient woman. She had a small flower store by the field, which she had turned into a unique vintage place. People went in there to take pictures, to gawk. Ivan John Smith got there by accident. He was in a hurry to go on a date with someone else's wife. Amber was working on her own that day, filling in for a sick employee. When Ivan John Smith saw her, he forgot where he was going. They talked for over an hour. Only then did his father see that there were 1,000 missed calls on his phone from this and that woman, who never waited for a date with a local businessman. Veronica hadn't agreed to go on the date, had refused, and Ivan John Smith realized we'll have to be persistent and came to her again and the other day too. It took a long time. He stopped going on dates because all his thoughts were occupied only with Veronica was then already over 40. She was a widow, and the flower store was inherited from her husband. She lived in a modest one-room apartment. Ivan John Smith proposed to her and told the world about it. Jackson then thought he'd been screwed by another money hunter and started giving advice, drawing up a prenuptial agreement so she wouldn't claim anything. Who knows, maybe she's a con artist. And my father took a serious look at Jackson. I don't want to hear that about my woman again. I'm not going to look at you like you're an adult. I'm going to take off my belt and give you a good thrashing. Jackson was surprised by this reaction. He didn't think much of the other women his father had dated, and now she cared so much. She had him pretty turned on. Jackson decided to get to know her better and started visiting. She cooked by herself. She was tired after work, but she did not give up her business and sometimes worked behind the counter. It was a pleasure for her. In addition, she knew how to remove stains, and at home she wore simple sports pants and a black t-shirt. She didn't show herself as a money hunter. When Ivan John Smith fell ill, she almost forcefully dragged him to the hospital and made him undergo a comprehensive examination. That was the first and last time he was in the clinic. Everything from his heart, pancreas to his liver and kidneys. Doctors prescribed medications that Ivan John Smith had to take literally like he was in a mental hospital. She made him take pills. She would put them in his mouth, swallow them, show her tongue, and sometimes even bounce them around for a while. She even made him stop drinking. It came out through a scandal, but she got the upper hand in that argument. Even John Smith hadn't had a drink in almost a month. Sometimes Jackson envied his father. His wife was loving, caring. He and Ashley were different. Jackson realized he wasn't in love with her. It was just the way things were. Ashley was there for him. She looked great. She knew how to present herself. She always behaved exceptionally well. She was the perfect partner, and Jackson often took her on deals. Ashley was cunning, had an understanding of human nature, and was able to gain the favor of people who considered themselves elite. Jackson himself would have dined with Aunt Mary the janitor. She always had a witty answer to any question, most often in rhyme. When Veronica and Sergei Borisovich and company entered the house, Jackson was not yet ready to hear about the inheritance. Surely his father had left the house and cars to Paul, and the company had gone to him along with all the official trappings. Gilbis accounts, the son thought, would also go to him. He needed them in case things went badly for the company. It was a safety cushion that his father had been building up for years. In fact, it was much more than he needed. He could have bought another company with the money. Jackson's father was a pedantic man and raised his son in strictness. In fact, Jackson himself was not spoiled. His father's country house was empty, and his son lived in a small one-room apartment in the center of town. Ashley didn't like it. She had hinted many times that after the wedding she would like to move into a house. But Jackson loved his little apartment. It had everything. It was conveniently located. Well, it looks like it's time to divide up what was once his father's. Now, this may seem a little surprising, but I can assure you that your father was of sound mind when he made it. The date of the last revision was November 12th of the year before last. There have been no changes since then. Personally, I was very surprised to see this document, but it's accurate. The firm's attorney and chief assistant continued. The firm and all the property has been reissued to Veronica. She is now the rightful owner. You, of course, won't inherit until 6 months from now, but you can take over the head chair now. It will be up to you, Jackson, to bring Veronica up to speed. It was like a thunderclap, a low blow. Jackson got nothing. The lawyer went on to say that Jackson's name wasn't there at all, unless his father left him his coin collection. All Jackson had left was the gift of the house in the country where he and his mother had once lived. It was their ancestral home, the first property Ivan John Smith had bought with his first $1 million. Jackson was left with only an apartment and a car he'd purchased on his own. Ashley was embarrassed. She hadn't expected this decision either, or was faking it well. Jackson stared at her, not knowing how to teach Veronica the ins and outs of the business he'd spent a lifetime learning since childhood. She just wouldn't be able to handle it. After the lawyer left, Veronica lingered. "I didn't. Really, if you want, I'll draw up a deed of gift or otherwise transfer the company to you." "Why would he do that?" "He was grooming you for his position." "I don't understand. I don't need the company. I have a job I love." Jackson sighed. Maybe he really should let him draw up the gift deed. But what the hell was this nonsense? How could his father do this to him? All through his childhood, he'd assured Jackson that he wouldn't need a guitar, that he'd own a company. Jackson gave up many hobbies to be a worthy replacement for his father, and now he was out of business. "Jackson, say something?" Veronica asked. He realized he'd been silent for too long. It's a shock. And the second one in the last few days. "I don't know what to say. It's what he wanted, isn't it? Maybe we should do as he decided." Veronica shook her head. "There are more letters from him." "What's in yours?" "Haven't looked yet." They read the letters drafted over a year ago. In them, without specifying his reasons, his father had asked Jackson to understand him and become a simple manager, and Veronica to leave the flower business and take over his company. It was hard to hold back the tears, reading letters from a man who was already dead. They both smeared them on their cheeks, feeling orphaned and acutely aware of how much their father was missed. "I need to think it over," Jackson said. "Okay, I'll do as you say. Don't worry, I don't need anything. You're his son, the direct heir, and everything will be yours if you want it." "Jackson, I'm not a con artist, and I didn't ask for anything to be rewritten to me." "I don't understand why he would do such a thing." Jackson smiles. "I think that's why he loved you. Before you, the only person in his life who loved him genuinely and demanded nothing was his mom." Veronica smiled sadly. Jackson, that doesn't make it any easier right now. I don't think I'll ever recover." She walked away so she wouldn't cry in front of him, realizing once again that he was having a much harder time. Once home, Jackson took a hot bath and went into the kitchen. The tables were deserted. Ashley was sitting in the hall typing something on the computer. "What's for dinner?" Jackson asked. "I ordered rolls. They'll be here soon." "You don't mind, do you?" She smiled. Jackson went into the kitchen and cleaned up. Ashley walked over to him there and, seeing him cross his arms over his chest, but I'm sorry, I'm not a cook. That's just the way I was born. We should think about using disposable dishes." "Ancients of the will was announced today," Jackson said, and gave the details. "What do you say to that?" "Sue her. Are you out of your mind? She's a con artist. But how can you do that? This Veronica here did a good job brainwashing your father." Jackson threw the coffee cup to the floor and Ashley shrieked. "Shut up. You don't know her at all. You know what? And you'd be a fool to give your father's legacy to some—" "Shut up," yelled Jackson. Loud argument broke out. Jackson was too vulnerable. He couldn't let anyone criticize his father's decision. He felt he had to protect him and not let him get hurt. Ashley wasn't concerned with that at all. What right did she even have to speak ill of his stepmom to his dad? Jackson went to sleep on the couch that night. In the morning, however, Emily asked him in a cold and calm tone, what has he decided to do? Nothing. It'll be just the way Dad wanted it. It's his money, and he can do with it as he likes. And since he has decided so, I will respect his decision. You're a complete fool, she said. I'm packing my things and I'm leaving you. Finally, Jackson thought. Of course, it hit him that he was only needed when he was potentially the owner of a huge company. A new period had begun in Jackson's life. Things were changing. The old life was crumbling through his fingers, and with it people were dropping out. It became clear who was with him because of his position and who was just for fun. For example, the firm's cleaning lady was loyal to the end, and when Jackson came to quit, she talked him out of it like he was her son. You shouldn't quit. She's going to ruin this place. This place has been built on your experience and your knowledge for years, and you're leaving. But why? Your father ruined it. That's no reason to burn everything on her. You work. This is your family's business. You know everything. But where are you going to go now? Jackson shook his head dejectedly, saying it was settled. He didn't want to stay, and not so much because of his pride, because of his ego. Yes, it was hard to stay in a company where you were the boss, and now you were an ordinary employee, but it was much harder to work in a place where everything resembled a father who was no longer there. Running away from herself, however, didn't end well. as expected. Veronica had begged Jackson not to leave, but he'd been adamant. If he decided that's the way it's going to be, your father certainly wouldn't want that. It's your farm. No, I think this is exactly what he wanted. I'll start from scratch. He'll leave all his toys to you, and I'll get my own business and leave it to my kids. Not sorry, kid. It's just that I'm really mad at him. It's not your fault. I know you didn't ask him to do this, but it was his last will, and I intend to honor it. Jackson walked away, got in his car, and drove out onto the road. Everything was behind him. His whole life had collapsed overnight. But before that, Ashley was waiting for him at home. She'd been his rock, albeit a shaky one. And now he had empty walls waiting for him, which were also a reminder that there was no one left around. With pain and resentment, he cried out and pressed on the gas. Jackson reached the upper threshold of speed, but he didn't exceed it. He didn't want to die. He just wanted to blow off steam. Suddenly, an expensive silver-colored foreign car came around the bend. Jackson slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The collision had happened. Only after the impact of the glass he remembered that he had not buckled up, and that one bored him sharply. The left sound came from the crash that had so begged him to do so. "You're the one who wrecked my car. Is my husband going to kill you?" Screamed Hannah in a white jacket. She was white, all whites. Curly, long hair, white clothes, shoes, purse. Only her mouth was colored red. Her thing was spinning, twirling. Jackson was taken by ambulance to the hospital. "We can let you go home if you want. Concussion." "No, just a bad bruise." "And shock, of course," the nurse said. "No," Jackson shook his head. "I don't want to go home. Can I stay with you? Maybe I could get an IV and put you to sleep. I haven't been sleeping much lately." The paramedics agreed, put Jackson on an IV, and he promptly passed out. 2 months passed. Ivan John Smith was sorting out his belongings at his country house. This was where he'd spent his childhood. Pictures of his parents hung everywhere, his old childhood drawings. Now it was the only place he could live. Jackson had a brilliant education, and of course, he didn't stay unemployed for long. He was immediately taken over by the local administration. He was hired as director of one of the departments, and he dealt mainly with documentation. After the accident, Jackson received an obscenely large bill from the woman in white he'd encountered. Friends advised him to sue. They said there were people who made money professionally from such accidents. The bill was just cosmic, but at the same time, everything on the merits. It was just that the car was extremely expensive, and all the parts were worth a lot of money. "I'll pay it," Jackson replied. I don't have the strength to sue." "Now." "Yeah, it could have been a scam." "Did you even look at the cameras?" "Yeah, I was driving like a madman, my own fault. I didn't have time to slow down. If I was going at a normal speed, I could have. Besides, the report's already been filed. It was the lady who was yelling, couldn't be around to pay." Jackson had to sell the apartment. He lost his father's account firm. He could have withdrawn his own savings, but it would have taken all his savings to pay for the repairs, leaving him with nothing. His father had taught him from a young age to always have a rainy day fund. That's the point. As long as you have a penny, there's no rainy day, the late Ivan John Smith used to say. Those words echoed in my ears now. The pain had not subsided in those 2 months, but humility had come. Jackson sold the apartment to a good family, taking only the necessities. He parted with the past and returned to his country home. For a week now he had tried in vain to clean up his own mess, but it had been a struggle. Now he was expecting a woman with a bucket and mop from a local company to ring the doorbell in a minute. Jackson knew getting here from downtown would be a problem and promised to pay for the trip. It needed to be cleaned up after years of neglect. He could take care of the day-to-day mess himself. Jackson tended to the rooms, thinking about how to rearrange the place so that the house would be a reflection of him, so that it would be comfortable and cozy. At the same time, he was clear that he didn't want to change anything here. It was his family home, so everything was in its place. It could use some cosmetic repairs. Just at that moment, the doorbell rang. Jackson went to open it, knowing it was the cleaning lady. But there was a pretty young girl standing on the doorstep. "Good afternoon. Who do you want?" he asked hesitantly. She was skinny with a long braid on her shoulder, minimal makeup, neat and simple jeans and a light jacket, without a hat, a heavy bag in her hands and a backpack behind her back. Like Jackson, he's the one who ordered the cleaning. She smiled. "And you're going to clean?" All by yourself? You can't handle it, he said. The girl was short, probably no more than 160 centimeters. She looked like a teenager. Who were you expecting, Miss Opera? Believe me, I can handle it. But where's your mess? Show me. Jackson was surprised at the girl's tenacity. He took her into the house, showed her the rooms. This place needs cleaning. I'd have to re-wallpaper a few places, of course. All in all, it's a few days' work. You can stay here tonight if you want. There's plenty of room. The girl folded her arms across her chest and smiled incredulously. No, don't think so. I'm not hitting on you. It's just a long drive. No, I didn't think anything of the sort. It's just that I have 3 kids at home. You have 3 kids? What are you, their sister? No, I'm their mom. I'm 32. But I look 17, she concluded. I wouldn't sell you liquor at the store. Well, that settles it. Let's get started. I've got everything with me. All you need is a bucket and access to water, if any. Jackson showed her what she needed and left for his father's office. He had cleaned it himself and had been living in it for a week now. There was a small couch, a television, and his own bathroom. What more did a single man need to live in a big house alone in a small pleasure? And soon he got bored of sitting in 4 walls. He came into the living room and didn't recognize her. Well, he recognized her just the same as when he was a child with his mother. Wow. Wow. I'll ask your company to give you a medal. A regular award will be enough for me, she smiled. What's your name? Sharon? Jackson picked up a rag and started to help with the cleaning. Sharon began to resent him for taking away my job. They quickly switched to you, and within an hour they were laughing like old buddies, discussing the latest news. A little later, Jackson went to the kitchen and decided to please his lovely guest with a delicious scrambled egg. However, she immediately burned out. Damn them, sin threw the culinary masterpiece into the trash can. What smells like you decided not to clean up, but to burn the place down. This place can still be saved, Jackson laughed. Why is she so funny? Did he want to feed you? It didn't work. Jackson nodded. Well then, let me figure something out. Sharon took over the cooking, and then everything went smoothly. And it did, in fact, go swimmingly. She made a beautiful vegetable stew out of whatever she could find in Jackson's bachelor kitchen. You're a good cook. You weren't kidding about the 3 kids, were you? He still couldn't believe Thumbelina had kids already. I wasn't kidding. Who jokes about that kind of thing? Now, the older Roxy's picking up Philip and Jason from school. My youngest is a twin. He goes to 1st grade on the 2nd shift. Sim is here. We had to split the students into shifts. It's a small school, so we couldn't fit everyone in. So the twins stay home alone until lunchtime. I'm always worried, but I can't help it. Wow. Why did one husband leave her for another? Jackson raised his eyebrows and even stopped chewing in surprise. I don't believe it. How could she be better than you? You're a marvel. Sharon was embarrassed. Jackson also realized that he'd given her an inappropriate compliment in the heat of the moment. She's richer. Her father's involved in crime. Everyone knows him. Alec Evans is a scary man. When Jake left me, he threatened to keep me away from him with the kids. Or they'd take the kids away from him, and I told him to stay out of my family. Otherwise, I can't take care of myself. You're a fighter? No, normally I can't even find a decent response to a rude conductor. But when it comes to my kids, it's like I'm a different person. Kids are great. You're lucky your husband left you, but you're not alone. You still have a family. My girlfriend left me, and I'm alone. You're a sweetheart. She skillfully returned the compliment. And Jackson smiled. She left when she found out I wasn't as rich as she wanted me to be. What an idiot. What does it matter what a man has? It's what's in a man that counts. But I guess I miscalculated that too. I was looking for something in the novel that wasn't there. They talked for almost an hour. Then Sharon went back to cleaning. It's getting late. Let me drive you home, Jackson suggested. I have to go into town anyway. He lied so she wouldn't say no. In truth, he wanted badly to just go to bed, but he couldn't make a mother of 3 jolt on the train at 2 in the morning. After she had cleaned his 3 rooms, cooked dinner, and helped him forget all his problems and worries for a full 5 hours. They rode in the car, listening to music. She looked at the lights of the city outside the window. You know, the last time I had a car ride like that was when I was a kid. My dad was a cab driver and he used to take me with him in the evenings. We drive around the city at night, racing down empty streets. It was the best time. When he pulled up to her house, he didn't even want to let her go. I'll come tomorrow, try to finish everything in a day. But if not, you'll have to put up with me for another day, Sharon said. Jackson smiled and nodded. He thought to himself that he wouldn't want her to finish cleaning so quickly. The next day, Sharon left the house, waved to the children through the window, and was surprised to find Jackson's car parked outside her house. At that moment, he looked out and waved at her. "Did you come to pick me up or didn't you?" She asked in surprise. "I didn't leave. I slept under your windows," Jackson smiled. "Get in." They drove, talking about children and the school system, and how much better and easier things used to be. At home, Sharon started cleaning, and Jackson did some paperwork. He was tormented by the thought that she would soon be out of his life forever. Somehow he wished she would stay. "You're a fool. Why are you clinging to her? You've only known her for a day. She's got kids, her own life. What do you need her for? And who told you she's better than Ashley?" He asked himself quietly, staring at his reflection in his extinguished smartphone. Jackson wondered, was he ever the same with Ashley? Simple and interesting. He'd probably gotten more sympathy and understanding from Sharon yesterday than he'd gotten from Ashley in their entire relationship. Jackson thought about her, deciding whether to ask her out to a movie, whether to get her phone number. And while he was thinking, Sharon herself walked into his office with some papers. "Jackson, you said your father signed everything over to your stepmother. I found a document that seems to say otherwise." She held out the sheets to him and Jackson began to read. His ears rumbled. Sharon had found a real will and given real letters, or rather, they were copies that his father had apparently made and put in the closet just in case. He didn't think Jackson would be living in the house anytime soon. In the letter, his father said he was proud of his son and that Jackson would own his company. He asked to take care of Veronica after he died, to call her, and if Veronica's son had difficulties, he asked for help. Jackson had heard that Veronica had an adult son but had never seen him. Veronica once said he lived out of town. The letter to Veronica was touching to the point of tears. He really loved her, trusted her, warmed the snake on his chest. It turns out she forged the will, so we can find mistakes, inaccuracies, and prove it. What a snake! She wasn't going to give me anything back. It was all rigged. This is the real will. It's the same date. He didn't change anything. It's all her, Veronica. So what are you going to do? Sharon asked. "I'm going to find her. But before I do, I want to ask for your phone number. I sat in the car like a fool for over an hour this morning. I couldn't call you." "Okay, but I think it'll be over by tonight." Jackson shook his head. "I'd like you to come to my house tomorrow as my guest. I feel good with you. I can't explain it. It just feels good, that's all." Sharon smiled. "Yeah, I feel like we've known each other a long time too. It's rare to feel that way." Jackson left her alone and left for his company's office. She was still his company. On the way, he consulted with a lawyer. "You know, I don't work there. Moore left right after you." "Veronica brought in some management people, I gather. Didn't bother to stay there. You say there's a real will. Did she really go for that kind of sneakiness after all?" Jackson and his father's former company lawyer talked for a long time longer, discussing what could be done. Veronica must have destroyed the original will. Of course, only she didn't know how pedantic and prudent Ivan John Smith was. Entering the office, Jackson could hardly recognize it. The people had changed. There was no one left in the old staff. Even his favorite Aunt Clava no longer greeted him, smiling happily. "What's going on here?" Jackson reached the principal's office. "Oleg Evgenievich is busy right now." "What did you want?" she asked. "Who's Oleg Evgenievich?" Jackson asked. The secretary was too pretty to be smart. Pouty breasts, lips, eyelashes so big her eyes barely opened. "Director," Jackson said in surprise. "As far as I know, the director of the company is a woman, isn't she?" The secretary shook her head. Jackson didn't wait for her permission to enter his former office and simply walked in. There was a middle-aged man sitting behind the desk. He had small, piggy eyes, glasses, and sparse bangs. "What did you want?" he asked cheekily. "Where can I find Veronica Ivanovna?" "The owner of the company," Jackson asked. "Veronica turned the business over to me. Now I'm the owner." "And on what basis?" Jackson asked. "On the basis of transferring all rights to me voluntarily." "And who are you?" "A lover, her husband." "Who are you by line?" the man asked. "A nobody. She just referred matters to me. These are our matters with her." She owed me a favor. And so we settled. Jackson turned around and walked out. It was even worse than he had anticipated. The house where Veronica used to live was gone. The flower store was closed. What had happened? Who did she owe money to? Jackson returned home, and there were more questions than Sharon had already left, leaving everything in perfect condition, and had even made him a sandwich. Well, how wonderful she is. Jackson made coffee, ate his appetizer, and called Sharon. He wanted to share with someone. He had so much going on that he couldn't keep it to himself. "Why did you leave?" "I would have driven you," he said. "I didn't want to bother you. You don't have time for me right now. By the way, what have you got there?" she asked. Jackson told her everything, and they began to think about what to do next. Sharon suggested that the first thing to do was to find Veronica and find out why she had done what she had done. Jackson was going to go to the police first, but she convinced him to do otherwise. He spent the next day looking for Veronica. He went to every address she could have been at. After lunch, he asked a policeman he knew for help. Then he went to Sharon's. He didn't know if she'd be happy to see him, but he wanted to talk to her. "Come in." Her grown daughter Roxy opened the door. She was already as tall as her mom, just as pretty, with brown eyes. Then Jackson met the twins. He never learned to tell them apart until the end of the evening, and they kept asking him if he realized which one was which. Finally, Jackson took out of his jacket pocket the pen he always carried with him and marked one of them, his namesake, Jackson. It was getting late. He should have gone home, but Jackson didn't want to. He wanted to stay, but it was inappropriate to ask to spend the night. The search for Veronica had been successful only after the police had gotten involved. Jackson had been given the address of a house far out of town in a small village. He drove there and was stunned. The house was dilapidated. The fence was dilapidated. Easier to burn the whole thing down than rebuild it. Does Veronica really live here? It can't be. There must be some mistake, Jackson thought. He knocked on the window, and soon Veronica came out onto the wooden porch. She looked the same as before, in simple clothes, no makeup. "Jackson, what are you doing here?" she asked. They looked at each other in disbelief and apprehension. He held out to her the document Sharon had found. Veronica squinted her eyes at it and quickly realized what she was holding in her hands. "Come on in. I'll explain everything," she said, and escorted him through the low doorway into the kitchen. Jackson sat down at the table. Veronica poured him some tea. "It's all about my son. I had him at 16. The labor was hard. I couldn't have any more children after that, but I adored him. You know, Jake's father was a gangster. He was into stealing, robbery. I knew all that. I was drawn to him. He could stick up for me, but he was respected and feared, even by killers. And I was like a stone wall behind him. But his lifestyle got him into a lot of trouble, including trouble with the law. I asked him to stop it, and he said if I chose him, I had to accept his lifestyle, accept it or leave. So I left. It wasn't until later that I found out I was pregnant. Soon he was locked up and I was alone with a belly. The parents helped, supported me. I adored my son, but Jake had always been a copy of his father. Since kindergarten, he'd held everyone in his fist. He was feared at school. He was the boss. They took him to the police station in 6th grade. I was so afraid for him. I could see he was following in his father's footsteps, but I couldn't do anything. Jake was like that. He did his time when he was 19. Then he'd get out, and then he'd go back to prison after a while. I just didn't know what to do with him. The last time he went to jail, he told me he'd fallen in with a bad crowd. The prison had its own mafia, a criminal mastermind who was being protected by serious people. They did that to a lot of people and got to us. Jackson looked at Veronica in surprise. What were they doing? They found out I was married to Ivan John Smith and started demanding money. I sold the flower store a month before he died. He didn't know. I was afraid to tell him. They threatened to kill him if he interfered through his powerful friends. They also threatened to kill my son. When the money ran out, they beat Jake and he died. I was afraid they killed him, but they had nothing to do with it. Jackson was supposed to come out soon, and they told me if I didn't do as they said, my son wouldn't come out. He just wouldn't live. They brought me the paperwork themselves, signed it themselves. I just showed them the original will and the letter. I'm sorry, Jackson. They switched everything, but they didn't give me my son back. He's missing. They won't let me see him. I sold everything I own. I finished remortgaging my apartment yesterday. I hope they'll be paid back soon. I gave away everything I had and everything Ivan John Smith had, but that's my boy, my only son. I'd give my life for him. Please don't judge me harshly. I loved your father, I really did, and I wouldn't take a penny from him just for me. You know that, don't you? I didn't need them. Jackson shook his head. You should have gotten help, but who's to say you'll get your son back alive? It's the mafia. I was once in love with one. That's my punishment. People like Philip's father are holding him hostage, and they talked for a long time. Jackson wasn't angry anymore. He realized Veronica was just in a bad situation. They took the real will. Yeah, but I want it. When they made a copy, I put the originals in a bag and took them away. They never asked about them again. Well, they forgot, but I'm not giving them to you until I see my son alive. Okay. When is he supposed to be released tomorrow? Just don't go to the police. Please don't worry. Jackson stayed at Veronica's. They finally talked as a family. They stayed up most of the night drinking tea, and in the morning they dozed off. A sound woke them up. As they pulled up to the house, a car brought Philip. Veronica ran out of the house. Jackson stayed inside. From the window, he saw two men carrying a third man on a stretcher. They carried him into the house. What's wrong with him? Veronica sobbed. His legs are gone. They were broken at the lumber camp. It happens. It can be repaired. Just don't go to the police. Watch out, or we might come back, one of the bandits said as they drove away. Jackson came out of the other room. I got them on my phone and I got their threats too. We'll prove everything. But it looks like your son needs to be cured first. Veronica was crying. Philip did too. He could talk, he could understand, but he was very weak. He hadn't been fed or bathed. He was wearing diapers. He must have been kept in some kind of infirmary or something. Jackson called an ambulance. Philip was taken to the hospital after getting the doctor's report. Veronica and Jackson exhaled. Surgery was possible, the doctors said. Philip said he fell down the stairs and was home alone for a long time. He didn't say anything to his mother. It was only when he and Jackson were alone that Philip admitted that he'd been beaten deliberately to intimidate him more. They'd gotten a lot from Veronica. A fortune in the firm. They needed a safety net. They wanted to kill me, but I didn't die. They said to let him live if he wasn't dead. I'm afraid they'll come back and kill me and my mom. We're a threat to them now that we're alive. And they'll need one more of her signatures when the deed to the apartment comes. And then that's it. I think they'll just bury us afterward. Jackson realized he had to act fast. His acquaintance on the police force, having heard the story, approached the colonel, who was an old family friend. After hearing what was going on in his town, the big boss ordered a special operation. Jackson handed them the videotape he'd made at Veronica's house and his father's real will. Afterward, she was terrified. It was scary that the bandits would find out about everything and kill them. But Philip was admitted to the hospital. Neither Paul nor Jackson could not afford a private clinic, so the son was in an ordinary one. There, in the same room with him, changed into a robe and slippers, lay an undercover policeman with a gun on his belt to protect him in case of emergency. And Sharon agreed to participate. Veronica said that all these companies Charles Edward kept a lot of important papers. There were Veronica's receipts that he made her write. There were videotapes Charles had shown Veronica that showed Philip being beaten and threatened to kill her if she didn't give them everything. Sharon was supposed to get a job at the company as a cleaner and retrieve the tapes. Jackson had a spare key to the safe. So it was just a matter of getting in there and taking it. After that, the criminals could be caught red-handed. Sharon called and was invited to an interview. Luckily, they were looking for an employee. The salary offered was small, but Sharon agreed to everything. The most unpleasant part, however, was meeting her ex-husband there. He had contacted the daughter of Charles Edward. He was the criminal mastermind who made me clean up like old times, Sharon grinned. I need the work. I'm actually raising 3 kids by myself, Sharon said, realizing she couldn't blow the operation. Now she was even more anxious to get them all arrested. Turns out her ex-husband was involved in this whole nightmare. And how many people, she wondered, had they so intimidated, beaten, and robbed? After getting through the humiliation, Sharon got to work. The first day, she didn't venture into the office. Her ex-husband watched her and kept trying to humiliate her. On the second day, he was called somewhere. Charles left too. Sharon was left alone in the office, inserted the key, took all the documents out of the safe and stuck them in the wastebasket. She left the camera there, only taking the memory out of it. Then she put the papers in the bag and quietly walked out of the building. But instead of the trash can, she turned the corner. It felt like she was being followed. At the corner, Jackson was waiting for her. Sharon almost ran. It was scary. "I did fine," he said, kissed Sharon. "We're going to get these rascals red-handed. I think I've been watched. They won't be able to find me. Tomorrow morning, Veronica puts the signatures at the MFC where the deal is processed. And that's it. That's where he'll be arrested. He won't turn away, won't say he didn't sign anything. And there are cameras everywhere. Call the office and tell them you found another job so they won't be looking for you. Anyway, sleep at my place tonight with the kids. He won't be looking for you there for sure." He picked them up and took them back to his place the same day. Now it was necessary to lure Charles out and get him at the scene of the crime. That would give a better chance of putting all the criminals away for a long time. "It's going to be okay. You sign wherever you need to and step aside. And I'll call you," the head of the special operation instructed Veronica. The document was to be signed by Charles Edward Gullivan himself. "I understand, but if anything happens to me, please take care," Veronica said. She went into the MFC building, signed the document. Charles was there as well. Veronica stepped aside, talking on the phone. At that moment, the police grabbed the perpetrator. The accomplices and the people who helped them commit lawlessness in prison were found and captured. "We have arrested them all. Now they are silent, hoping for lawyers. But they were taken too when it was all over." Jackson returned to his house and realized he hadn't called Sharon in ages. He dialed her, but she didn't answer. Was she hurt? Sounds like it. Jackson got in his car and drove to her house. Rang the doorbell. She opened it. "IAA. But you're not answering your phone. Just thought you didn't want to communicate since you haven't called all these days. I called it myself. You hung up? Well, so I figured." Jackson shook his head. "Oh, women. I'll tell you all about it now, and you'll realize why you were wrong." Jackson's tale took a good deal of time. Sharon listened to him with her mouth open. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was like this. I thought you were just ignoring it. I mean, you said you wanted to communicate. You picked up the phone and disappeared. Is that what's going on here? It's just that usually a person doesn't call. There's only one reason. They don't want to. Isn't that right?" Jackson smiled. "Not always. They talked for a long time. On the way to her place, Jackson stopped by the store and bought the kids a bunch of candy. What's going to happen to Jake now? He doesn't walk. He's lucky to be alive at all. They did things to him like that. As soon as I get my father's company back, I'll pay for his surgery. At the best clinics overseas." Then Sharon asked. "No, we have excellent doctors, I've already found out. It's only a matter of time. I've already sent them inquiries and prepayments. I had some money left over when I sold the apartment. So, the treatment will start soon. He'll be prepped for surgery for a few weeks to get his labs back to normal. And these people, Charles Edward, they're no longer dangerous. Probably not, but there's no guarantee. Who knows what connections they have left? Maybe they'll want revenge." Noah Judge Sharon sighs. "I wouldn't want anything to happen to you." Jackson smiled. How nice it was to hear that she cared about him. "Did I clean your house for nothing?" Jackson began to visit them every day. The children had gotten used to him. The eldest was wary of him, but he managed to gain her trust. Sharon had grown accustomed to Jackson and trusted him completely. They were very good together, as if they had been made for each other. Litigation began to take the companies out of the hands of the crooks. Philip testified, which was taken into account in court. Veronica testified too. There were others who testified. Veronica wasn't the only one who signed over her assets to Charles Edward. The newspapers were full of headlines about the uncovering of a major crime ring. The case had gotten a lot of publicity. Philip, on the other hand, was being prepped for an operation in the capital. "You have to give blood. It's a precautionary measure," the doctor said. "I'm his only relative," Veronica informed him, and she was led into the office. She was with Philip in Moscow, while Jackson and Sharon stayed in their home. Their little town was only a few hours from Moscow. So when Veronica called Jackson, he quickly packed up and hit the road with Sharon. "Are we sure we'll be back before tonight?" she asked. "I promise. Just need to give blood. I don't know if mine will fit, so if you donate too. But if yours fits, he has some rare type. Surgery is coming up and I have a rare one too," Sharon informed. "But actually, it's usually relatives who pass. Veronica donated, but her blood didn't match. Isn't she his mom? Sharon wondered. Yeah, the doctors checked. They have different DNA. I don't know where they messed up. Veronica's in a terrible mess right now, doesn't know what to think. But the bands are so different, she just couldn't be his mother. Arriving at the clinic, Jackson found Veronica crying. Well, how can that be? His blood type is so different, you just can't find it. And they say I'm not the mother. Like Jackson hugged her. The doctor came over to them and explained everything again, what the blood was for, what kind of blood was needed, and what quantity. If something went wrong, they needed backup. I have that type. Sounds like you're lucky, Sharon smiled. Jackson put his arm around her. You're my treasure. Come with. Veronica and Jackson stayed in the hallway. I have to talk to the doctor. But where is my baby if Philip isn't mine? I can't believe it. I mean, he looks so much like his father, but I thought he did. Is it really just a coincidence? It just doesn't make sense. Sharon gave blood. After a while, the doctor told her that their DNA and Philip were related. Now that thought kept her on her toes. Jackson drove her home and left. There was no place to sleep. Lots of kids, small apartment. Maybe we should move them to my place, he thought. He disliked the thought more and more. Dad wouldn't approve of her. She was probably a janitor. He was a little prejudiced. Like, for example, Veronica was a store owner. He would hardly have looked at her if she had been a janitor. It's a good thing I'm without those arrogant cockroaches in my head, Jackson thought. He was perfectly happy thinking about Sharon. So small, so cute. Just a miracle. A few days passed and Philip underwent surgery. The doctors said it had been a success and he would now begin his recovery. The company belonged to Jackson again. He received the documents and immediately returned to his office. Everything here reminded him of his father, but the memories were different now. Everything that had happened lately had forced Jackson to accept the fact that his father was gone. Now he was anxious to preserve and grow the family fortune, except that the bandits had left the firm in a dismal state in a matter of months. Reports were overdue. The IRS demanded the day before yesterday. Jackson had been at work all day, but now he remembered to call Sharon, lest she decide she didn't need him again. Jackson was happy to have a place to come back to. He started sleeping over at Sharon's, got himself a couch, ordered delivery, put it in the corner at Sharon's room from Poltava. That was the official story. In reality, as soon as the kids fell asleep, he would move in with her, cuddle up to her, and fall asleep. Meanwhile, Veronica found out why her blood and her son's blood turned out to be different. After Philip's surgery, she went to the maternity hospital where she had given birth when she was very young. An old friend of hers was working there at the time. She was a little older and had interned as a midwife. Now Kathy had worked there for many years. Veronica drove there, found her, and walked into the office. Kathy saw her and sighed heavily. I knew you'd come to see me one day. Come in, she said. Do you know why I came? Veronica asked. Her friend nodded. Will you explain how so? Philip is not my son. Where's my baby? You gave birth at 16, and the labor was hard, and the doctor wasn't there that day. The nurse was drunk and got fired. I'm all alone here. It's a small ward. No referrals. They were already taking everyone downtown. At the time, we thought they'd close the hospital, but later they renovated it. You remember fainting, don't you? I thought you were going to die on me. And when I delivered your baby, it was my first labor, Veronica. I delivered it, and your baby was born dead. I was alone, and there was a mom in the next room who said she was going to write a DNR. She didn't have the courage to abort, so she decided that she would give the baby to someone who needed it more. That mommy had a 1-year-old daughter in her arms. It wasn't easy for her, you know. Veronica cried, remembering it all. And why did my baby die? Did you do something wrong, or did I? You were too young to give birth. You're skinny now, but back then you were dystrophic. The labor was hard, that's all. Your body couldn't handle it. The baby was tiny. And we had no equipment, nothing. It's nobody's fault. I gave birth dead, that's how it happened. And I took that woman's baby. I just gave it to you. She left the hospital right away. I forged the papers. No one found out then, and you were happy. Veronica, I was afraid you'd kill yourself. You wanted this baby so badly, even though you knew you'd have to raise him alone. I mean, after you broke up with his father, you just kept thinking about it. And when the doctor said you couldn't have any more children, I knew it was worth it. Don't be mad. She didn't want a baby. But you did. But who would feel bad about that? Veronica shook her head. No one. Thank you, at least now I know the truth. And thank you again, my dear. They hugged, and Veronica stayed with her friend for a long time. She wasn't angry. Katie had made a hard decision that could have ended her career as a doctor once and for all. And Veronica didn't love Philip any less. He was still her son. Besides, all these events had brought her closer to Jackson, and now she thought of him as her son too. Tell me, what is my Philip's mother's name? When I told him my blood wasn't a match, she asked me that. Oh, I remembered that for the rest of my life. His mother is Anna Frederica Ivano. Veronica told Jackson that name, and he called Sharon. This is my mom, Anna Frederica Ivano. I'll be right there, Sharon said, disbelieving her ears. The doctors weren't wrong. Her blood was a match precisely because she and Philip were related. Hi, she said into the phone. Do I have a sibling? There was a pause on the other end of the phone. The mother confessed that she was expecting a child but didn't want it. It just happened. She couldn't abort it. A lot of people were wrong. Every time she tried to walk into the hospital and make an appointment. And when a nurse told her that a young girl had lost her baby but didn't know it yet, Anna herself suggested, give the boy away. Let her be a happy mom. You understand, we had a daughter. You were hard to raise. We couldn't handle it. Sharon said she understood, but she was still angry at her mom. She started calling Philip regularly, asking how he was doing, how his recovery was going, and when he was brought back to town, she became a regular at Veronica's house. Sharon was drawn to her brother, and Philip was glad to find his sister too. He'd always dreamed of it, but knew it wouldn't happen. Jackson, on the other hand, had officially married Sharon, and he threw a grand banquet. The company's business was booming, and after hearing the company's story, people were drawn to Jackson. The media made him look like a hero for uncovering a criminal conspiracy. With such a man, everyone wanted to cooperate. Jackson also officially adopted all of Sharon's children, and they began to get used to calling him Daddy. I have a surprise for you, she said when she met Jackson after another day of work. Guess what it is? He smiled, inhaling the delicious scent. He knew immediately that Sharon had made his favorite cabbage and caviar pie. Anna walked over and showed Jackson a pregnancy test with 2 clear stripes. Wow, is this what I'm going to be, a father? He was shocked. Sharon nodded, and he hugged her tightly. But tell me, she asked, not yet realizing how he would feel about it. They already had 3. Yes, I'm insanely happy, Jake. I'm happy, Jackson cried with joy. As a matter of fact, when he had been told he had a daughter, he had cried too. Now he was an absolutely happy father. He only regretted that Daddy hadn't lived to see this moment. He'd given him a country house, dreaming that Jackson would have a big family. And now he had one, and Jackson often remembered how he thought he should have 2 sons and 2 daughters. And now he did. Marion Morris had long since stopped being dreamy. She had a lot to worry about in this life. Not long ago, her father had left the family, leaving his wife with an invalid mother and 3 minor children alone. The 19-year-old girl was the main helper in this family. Sometimes it even seemed that she had become a substitute for her father. The mother had a quiet, calm character, but she was never affectionate and attentive to her relatives. Especially her indifference lately extended to the elder Marion, whom she more often called Mary, and treated her as if she were a neighbor's girl. Mrs. Kimberly, a mother of many children, had another son aged 11 called Jack and a very young daughter, a preschooler named Cassandra. There were rumors in the neighborhood that Marion was not with Marcus, Kimberly's ex-husband, but with some longtime pal of the woman. Most likely a drinking buddy, she liked to get down to the bottle, just like her husband. But then one day, Marcus had an irreparable event. He suddenly had an epiphany, became more and more interested in newfangled trends for a healthy lifestyle, and attempted various diets. First, Marcus gave up his family's favorite sausage sandwiches in the morning, then all meat dishes. Kimberly began to buy more fish, which her husband had not yet given up, but this did not save their marriage. Marcus then became a raw food eater, and then starved. More and more often, instead of having a glass or 2 with his wife and friends, he started to go to the forest, walk there for several hours and just enjoy nature. He found adherents on social networks. Almost all of them were men and unmarried. It was interesting for the aspiring vegan to observe the lifestyle of these freedom-loving guys through photos and videos on the internet. And increasingly he was disappearing outside the house, away from his family, his children, his wife, and his sick mother-in-law, with whom his relationship never worked out. I felt life. I had to change something in my destiny. He shared these sentiments with his friends more and more often. And then one day, lying on the sofa after another inspiring walk, Marcus looked at his wife and fussing children and realized he had to leave. As Marcus packed his things, Kimberly just lay motionless in the room. Sometimes it seemed like she was sobbing, but she had found out about her husband's decision a couple of days before he left, had an argument with him, even a bit of a fight, and then just realized there was nothing she could do about it. Marcus put his arm around his son and kissed the still uncomprehending Cassandra, who had been asking him all the way, "Dad, when are you coming?" And her question remained unanswered every time. Then the prodigal father, ready to leave the house with his bags, where a taxi was waiting for him in the street, looked at Marion, who was standing aside. He approached her slowly and said, "Marion, look for yourself." The girl looked at him questioningly. "Look for yourself. Look inside, you have a light. You're going to make it." "Okay," the daughter answered confusedly. This large family was left alone, without a father, without a breadwinner, without a protector. Now both mother, grandmother, and Marion, as the oldest members of the family, began to think more and more often about how to feed the children. Marion had felt lonely almost from childhood. She had friends, some of her classmates stayed in town. Most of them had moved to places more suitable for earning and living. One such friend was Gabrielle Jones. She had known Marion since first grade. They both sat in the fan seats at the outdoor stadium, where town sporting events were often held. Marion decided to tell her friend about the recent changes in their family. "So anyway, my dad left my family." "Really?" Gabrielle put both hands on her head, trying to act dramatic. "Yeah, he just left. Packed his things, said goodbye, said some rubbish to me." "What kind of stuff?" "Yeah, it was bullshit." Marion smirked. "Look for the fire inside," said the girl. Gabrielle laughed out loud, followed by the storyteller. They were both rolling on the floor with laughter. But then, calmed down, Marion went on again. "Yes, he's been strange lately. To tell you the truth, I didn't feel sorry for him." "Strange? What do you mean?" "Going into the woods, not eating meat, and all that." "Yeah." And anyway, Marion looked away and smiled faintly. She took out a packet of cigarettes. "What?" "What? Say what you want to say." "I don't even know." It was obvious that Marion hesitated to tell her, or to keep secret what lurked in her soul. She didn't know whether to tell even her best and time-honored friend at such moments. "Marion, we've known each other so long. Maybe I'm worried." Gabrielle bought her friend a smoke and she gave in. "Yeah, they say he's not my father. I don't know whether to believe it or not." "That's weird, who's saying that?" "Mrs. Cheryl from up the street, Mom and Dad's friends. I haven't heard it myself, but it's all come to me recently. It's so annoying to be told you've heard it somewhere. I mean, everyone's talking about it now." "Yes," said Gabrielle thoughtfully. All evening and all night, Marion worried about her decision to tell her friend about the rumor, for even she did not know if it was true. Marion had worked before her father and family left, but it was more of a part-time job than a full-time job. She handed out leaflets. She was a sales consultant in a clothing shop. She traveled with goods to various addresses in the city as a courier. Now it had been decided by the family council that Marion would go to New York to work. Kimberly had already managed to call her sister, who worked in one of the grocery shops of a large chain in the city. Catherine was a receptionist and had once long ago offered Kimberly a job at an open sales position. Kimberly had been taking care of the younger Cassandra at the time, and Marion couldn't sit with her since she was already moonlighting somewhere. When Marcus left, she remembered her sister's offer. It was Marion's first day of work. She was to come to the shop and talk to Mrs. Catherine and listen to a short lecture on her job description. Marion took her packing seriously. She put on dark trousers and her best, almost unworn jumper. Her mother saw her fiddling in the mirror and putting on her makeup. "Why are you going to be a shop assistant?" she said squeamishly and almost indifferently, standing on the threshold of her daughter's room. Marion made no reply. She had long ago reduced her intercourse with her mother to a minimum, and spoke to her only on business. She loved her, of course, but it was easier this way. Marian had long felt that her mother's attitude to her was mainly consumerist, and she did not want to be personally convinced of it. This woman seldom cared for the girl's personal problems. Her name had long been associated in this family with the words, help, do, and fetch. It was a long drive from small town to big New York City, where Marian had only been a couple of times in her entire 19-year-old life. She was riding on the bus and listening to her favorite music on the player, looking around at the surrounding farms and small towns along the way. Suddenly, she felt sad. The girl thought about her life in her childhood. It turns out I hardly had one. She remembered quite the early years when there were 3 of them. Her mother and father. They had been younger, funnier, and friendlier then. Her mother would hug her at times, kiss her forehead, and her father would joke merrily, tossing his little girl in the air. Father and mother drank less, they were lively, but then brother Jack was born and relations in the family, for some reason, deteriorated. Marian was only 8, and she already had to almost run from school to sit with the baby. From then on, the girl began to feel that she was no longer perceived as before, as a daughter, as a girl, as a living person who had a beating heart inside. More and more often she began to hear, "You must, don't forget," and other words containing requests, if not orders. And less often she received words of approval, care, and love. When Cassandra was born, Marian realized that she was certainly not going to have a carefree life now, and she was right. Jack went to school, and Kimberly had her 3rd child. Marcus began drinking more and participating less in the family's life. His wife, who had many children, soon had to look for work, as he quit his job and started looking for work himself. These searches were passive, and every time he was asked about his progress, he sadly replied that there were no suitable vacancies yet, that the salary at the interview was lower than the stated salary. There were many other reasons why he couldn't get a job at his working age, being a fit and healthy man. Kimberly understood that he had no desire to get up every weekday from his favorite sofa and deny himself daily drinks with friends and watching humorous TV shows and series about the police. But what was to be done? Her husband's temper was sometimes harsh, and he could, even when he was in a depressed mood, use his hands, but not against the children. All in all, Kimberly knew she shouldn't have disturbed him. She had also hoped that he would be involved with the kids, but that wasn't happening either. You did your homework and clean up after yourself. That was usually the extent of her father's attention. During this period, Kimberly began to look more and more closely at her eldest. She was already 14 years old when Cassandra was born. One day she told the girl bluntly, "I'm working, money is tight. You need to get a job too." Marian was a serious child, and after a month she started bringing in a small income for the family. She barely had enough for her own needs. She gave almost everything to her mother. Once Marian dared to ask her why her father did nothing, and then she regretted it for a long time. So many negative words and emotions in her direction she had never heard before, became very offended. And at that moment, everything changed in her soul. If her mother did not become her enemy, then her attitude to her, seemingly to the most dear person, became indifferent. Soon Kimberly noticed this change in her daughter, and instead of discussing with her the reason for her reticence, she began to respond in the same way. They were both bound together only by their concern for Jack and Cassandra. Marian became a second mother to these children. Kimberly was not only absent from work, sometimes she arrived very late, and no one knew what the real reason for her delays was. The sick grandmother was out of the picture in this family, and in that she and Marian were alike. She lay in her room and occasionally chatted with her grandchildren. There were medicines lying everywhere, and there was almost always a television on. Marian liked to share some of her less than obvious experiences with her, but as time went on, her grandmother began to feel worse and worse. She was in the hospital or just sleeping. Her grandchildren visited her less and less. On her face one day appeared an expression of indifference to life. All these moments of her life replayed in her head mysterious black-browed girl sitting on the last row in the bus, and sometimes her eyes filled with tears. Well, at least we'll have more money, so she comforted herself at the end of her heavy thoughts. Soon the announcement was made. New York terminus. Marian sighed. She wanted to ride in this old bus, to look at the trees at home and just think, dreaming of a better life that might never come. Marian got off the bus and slowly made her way towards the city center. The stop was located on the very outskirts of town. She saw a few older houses. They were located on an elevated area. The further she traveled towards the shop, the more modern scenery she encountered. Finally, she saw a large grocery shop. It was beautiful, all glass and with glowing letters on the roof. It was a very huge building. Marion walked inside the premises. There was an escalator running right in front of the entrance. On the ground floor, there were little stalls with balloons, with unusual lollipops and different bling. And all this colorful picture briefly caught the eye of a girl from a small town, who did not often come to such crowded places. First, she wanted to buy a beautiful knitted bracelet with stones. Then she looked long and fascinated at the golden statue of a dragon. "I'd like to take one of these home," Marion dreamed. After about 10 minutes of excitement, she remembered that she had not come to go shopping, but to get a job in a grocery shop. But where was it? So it's a shopping center, I guess, she thought. The sign said the grocery shop was on the first floor. At the shop, Aunt Catherine met her niece and immediately started telling her about the duties. There were a lot of them, and one had to listen carefully. Marion knew that Catherine didn't like to repeat herself and took her personality very seriously. Perhaps that was why she and Kimberly didn't get along very well. Her sister in conversation could take offense at nothing, but seriously. Marion was issued a uniform. She was assigned a mentor, a petite blonde woman of about 45 named Selena. She spoke quietly and quickly, sometimes even slurring her words. The girl's first day as a trainee was hectic but unnoticeable. With her anxious thoughts and running after Selena, Marion didn't notice how her shift ended. 9 p.m. "You can pack up." Her mentor walked up to her. "What about you?" "Me too. Let's go to the back room and change there." "Did I work well?" Marion asked. "Yes, you've been fine." It's hard to tell from the first day. Marion calmed down. For some reason, she thought she had made a lot of obvious mistakes, but it turned out that her mentor did not notice anything, or considered all her faults as insignificant. Either way, she was glad for the end of the day, even though no one had praised her. The main thing was that she hadn't messed anything up. So a month passed and Marion received her first salary, as well as her new position as a sales consultant. The probationary period past this event was the main success she had had recently. One day she came home and found her mother at home, peacefully making soup in the kitchen. Suddenly, for the first time in a long time, she wanted to share her achievement at work with her. She went into the kitchen, and she and her mother exchanged a few words. "No, I won't," Marion thought. "She's all about the money, and that's all that matters." Soon Marion had established herself in her position at the shop. She did her job splendidly and had no complaints about life. She was given a pay rise and once even made Employee of the Month. She was now used to sharing her successes only with herself. Her friend Gabrielle got married and moved in with her husband in Chicago. At times, Marion thought of her and even envied her happiness a little. Yet on the whole, she was content with what she had. The girl had become truly independent. And it was not only about financial independence, because now she could afford to spend more on herself. In addition to all this, she changed personally. She didn't need company at all. She didn't want to talk or listen to anyone. She worked and helped her mother with her children. It would seem that what else was needed for her? A person who had long been deprived of any ambitions. And yet she wanted to love. Marion tried to get into relationships with guys, but after a few short attempts she realized that she didn't want to be with just anyone to have fun and arrange romantic evenings. All these young people were not in a hurry to be serious about Marion. "You're a little too outspoken." Gabrielle had hinted to her in the days when they still lived in the same town. "You're a bit, I'm sorry, not feminine, are you?" she once said. Marion tried to hide the feeling of offense, but she had a great complex in her heart. She was indeed a little coarse, her voice was low, her features, though beautiful, were in many ways boyish, her nose with a hump, her slightly extended manly lower jaw, and her eyes, those brown, thoughtful eyes, in which something deep, secret, and serious was read. It had been 2 years since Marion had taken a job with Aunt Catherine. She was 21 years old and in love. Stephen Howard worked as an area manager for a shopping center and occasionally went into the shop to check on the quality of the staff. He took a fancy to an unusual black-browed girl, and she took a fancy to him. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His expression always conveyed good-naturedness, and the high-browed, bony blonde named Stephen was liked by all the cashiers and saleswomen in the shop, and they were not shy about exchanging a few enthusiastic words among themselves after he left. Stephen had come on board later than Marion had started working here. For 6 months they exchanged glances, but one day Stephen did get bold enough to make the first move. She was standing at the meat counter. The shop was unusually small and the clerk had nothing to do. It was the right moment for the two of them. She heard behind her, "Girl, why are we standing there? Why are we not working?" It was funny that Marion, who was tired of working days from domestic cares with her brother and sister, at first reacted to the manager's remark sharply and negatively. She turned round and stared at the man with her deep and intense gaze, squinting her thick, dark eyebrows. "I work when there's work to be done. Are all the shelves filled with merchandise? Customers don't need counseling? Is the warehouse in order?" In a monotonous and slightly raised tone, Stephen bombarded the young saleswoman with work-related questions. She stood in silence for a few seconds, not taking her stern gaze off the man, of course, realizing that she would be in trouble if she continued to be rude. It was obvious that she was facing a representative of the management. However, being in a bad mood and hurt by the phrase about idleness in her address, as well as unpleasant questions that sounded like complaints, she could not keep her discontent to herself. "I've worked here for 2 years and no one has ever complained about me. If you want to be the first to do so, be my guest." Marion had that unpleasant quality from childhood. She sometimes could not hold back her sudden anger. She'd had a couple of fights at school, the so-called shooters. There were also attacks of uncontrolled aggression, but all these moments were rare because at home reigned complete indifference. And it would be strange to behave in such a way when neither mother nor father even asked you questions about your affairs, not to mention serious conversations about studies, personal life, or smoking, standing in front of a shop management representative. For the first time in years, Marion remembered her peculiarity. Her face was covered with color, her eyes glistened, and in her soul there was both dislike and fear for her position, without which she had not seen a full life for herself and her family for a long time. Everything hung on this fragile girl. Suddenly, the stern expression on Stephen's face changed to one of mortification and contentment. He looked at the name on her badge and said in a good-natured tone, as if afraid of her hurt feelings, "Marion, I don't know your patronymic, but I can see that you are a man of character, and I hope you have a good sense of duty. A man like you should be. I didn't mean to offend you in any way. I am here to make our business grow and become as profitable as possible." Marion made no reply, but felt as if the manager still had something to say she was not mistaken. And he continued after a short pause. "How do you get on here?" "I can't complain," she mumbled. She wanted to go to the warehouse, but sensing that the beautiful and daring and even more beautiful girl wanted to leave, Stephen decided to act immediately. He had already spent 6 months looking for her casually through the stalls. "Marion, let me give you my number, so you can be my assistant and keep me informed of how things are going in the warehouse." Marion smirked. She had calmed down a bit, and instead of irritation, there was curiosity. "What do you want me to do? Rat out my colleagues?" "I'm sorry, doing what?" Stephen smiled just as amiably. "Marion, I'm just collecting employee numbers. But they're on the database, if anything." The manager was not angry with Marion. On the contrary, he found her a very interesting person, and all her mockery, inappropriate grimaces, like a lack of etiquette when talking to the bosses, only made him angry. He wanted to know more about the girl. "All right, in base, I'll write to you, go to the warehouse." Marion went away. She was filled with one great and vivid feeling. No, it was not anger. It was love at its most embryonic stage, when we are not yet sure of our feelings, and are ashamed of ourselves, ashamed of our thoughts about the person, for we know nothing about him. The same thing was happening to Marion when she just stood in the warehouse by the boxes and did not move, because her new thoughts prevented her from concentrating. "Manager, what did he want from me?" Bullshit. After a peculiar interaction with the new employee, Stephen approached Selena. "Who is this hooligan you have working here?" He smiled at the saleswoman. Morris Selena sighed. "I think she's Mrs. Catherine's niece. That's all I know." "How's the job?" "We're responsible. Not bad, helpful." "All right, thanks, I'll be off." Stephen left the shop in a pleasant thoughtfulness, and afterwards thought for a long time about the young, tall brunette with a serious and beautiful look of big brown eyes. For a long time, neither Marion nor Stephen forced themselves to continue this informal chat. Stephen arrived a couple of weeks later. He didn't write or call her as he had promised. After chatting with the manager, the man in love immediately approached Marion and said in a loud voice, "We need to talk. Please go to the warehouse." There were salesgirls and the manager around, still not far away, and the manager did not at all want to be judged by the junior staff here in the future. He was merely pretending that he intended to reprimand the salesgirl. Marion was frightened for a moment, forsook thoughts of the beauty of her lover's eyes and lips, which in a fortnight had bored her, and thought of the dreadful thing, which was the word dismissal. They both walked slowly towards the warehouse. There was no one there, and the only witnesses to Stephen's forthcoming revelations would be the numerous boxes of foodstuffs. "Marion, I'll tell you straight away, no complaints." She looked questioningly at her boss. "I like you here, round and round. I do not want to go round. I want to try to communicate with you." She looked somewhere to the side, down, and smiled sweetly and embarrassedly, as if wanting to answer something. Her lips involuntarily shook, and a slight, but still noticeable to the interlocutor paint, covered all her beautiful face. "Well, you think, here's my number." Marion took from the man a small white card with printed lettering and logo. As he walked away, she examined it. Stephen Howard, business consultant. Below it in even smaller print was a list of his services and his phone number, the most important thing for which this business card had been handed to her. It was a beautiful time, spring. It was around this time that Marion and Stephen began dating. They didn't advertise their relationship. The territorial manager came to the shop as usual, a couple of times a month, and communicated only with those with whom he was supposed to communicate by work. He and Marion even tried not to look at each other. One day during a smoke break, Selena brought up Stephen. There were 3 female shop workers standing outside in a circle. They should have finished their smoke break sooner rather than later, as the shop was left to 2 people, one of whom was a young girl who, just like Marion, had come here a couple of years ago and knew next to nothing. Molly, the cashier, put out her cigarette butt on the rubbish bin and, carefully dropping it there, walked off into the building with a quick step. Selena and Marion took quick puffs to finish their cigarettes and go to their seats. "And are Stephen's all right?" Selena, who was not particularly noted for her participation in gossip, replied cryptically. "Who do you mean, Selena?" Marion asked, though she knew it could only be about the manager. "Stephen Howard." "Yeah, he seems nice." "Marion, are you two dating by any chance?" Selena asked, and the question changed the expression on her colleague's face. "No." "What makes you think that?" "Well, I don't know, it just seemed like an experience." "I don't know what your experience is. You're paying attention to the wrong things," Marion snorted unfriendly. "Maybe not, but just in case he's just not your best option, it's best not to get involved." Marion didn't say anything back to her. She was surprised by her colleague's words. She didn't understand why Selena started to be frank about her boss, and why she was so sure of their connection. The saleswoman wasn't fooling her, though. She had indeed speculated and just guessed that was what was called experience. The quiet, silent worker, who had never been seen discussing colleagues before, suddenly decided to share her suspicions about Stephen with the young employee. Perhaps Selena recognized Marion as herself, and Stephen resembled someone from her past life. The feelings and thoughts that had prompted her to talk remained unknown to Marion. Marion had been her own person for a long time, and she made all her own decisions. She didn't rely on anyone, and she didn't count on anyone. Stephen was a ray of sunshine that had suddenly come into her life. He was a real grown man, capable of courtship, gifts, and displays of affection. Marion had never met a man like him before. All the few partners she'd had were boys, not men, and it wasn't even a matter of age. All they could offer was a trip to a cafe and a sleepover at their house when her parents were away. Stephen, on the other hand, was a wealthy man. He was 30 years old and had already been living alone for several years in his own flat, which he had partly earned himself. His parents were honorable, educated people and wished their son a similarly honorable party. They were both university professors, and many of their students seemed to them good candidates for the role of their son's future wife. But Stephen often referred to the busyness at work and did not come to these nice acquaintances, and if he did, all communication ended with a banal gesture of propriety. He walked the student home and wished her good night. It's not like that. Each time Stephen complained to his parents, begging them to stop these useless acquaintances. His father and mother were genuinely perplexed and asked their son what he wanted. and he only answered, "I'm a grown-up uncle. I'll sort it out myself." So what did the 30-year-old territorial manager of a large grocery chain, Stephen Howard, really want? Firstly, the man was somewhat annoyed by any desire of people, even his closest relatives, to dictate his life. He was used to being the king of his life, and only circumstances that happened to us not of our own free will could change his trajectory. No one in this world was an authority to him, only himself. Some of Stephen's acquaintances called his characteristic overconfidence, and more than once he was advised to listen to the opinions of others, and yet he did things his own way. When he succeeded in his career, he clearly realized that he was on the right path. Strangely enough, he had no clear goal in matters personal. Stephen did not strive, as his parents put it, to find a worthy party, although he was already 30. Perhaps romance lived in this purposeful and pragmatic man. There wasn't much of it, but he, just like his new love Marion, believed that you just had to find your man. It didn't matter to him that his girlfriend hadn't accomplished much in life and worked at the grocery shop in the lowest position. He liked her dark, always, as if on something focused eyes and rough, but at the same time so beautiful and attractive features of the face. Yes, he felt in this difficult, silent girl his own man. Marion had almost ceased to sleep at home. Her mother, of course, was not happy with her, although now their financial situation had improved markedly, and her daughter threw a certain amount of money into her account every month. Since Marion began to date Stephen, the amount became even greater. It was because the young man was giving her money for personal expenses, which meant that the mother was now allowed to throw even more money. Marion understood and didn't argue with her when she spoke. "You have decided to pay us off," she replied. "Yes, you may consider it so," and went to work, and then to Stephen's house for the night. Stephen was in no hurry to offer to move Marion into his flat. What was it he couldn't exactly figure it out himself? Perhaps it was some insecurity about his feelings. Or maybe, despite his independence, he was still afraid of his honorable parents and ashamed of the 22-year-old shop assistant who had been his girlfriend for 6 months. In any case, after some time in the soul of this successful man, there was a certain dissonance. He as if began to slowly retreat back. 6 months later came the crisis in this unequal relationship. Marion, tired and broken, came home more and more often to spend the night. Stephen looked for all sorts of excuses not to invite her over. Her mother smirked one day when she saw her daughter on the doorstep late at night. "What, did he leave you?" Marion answered her nothing, by the way. She did not tell her a word about her young man. And so several months passed. Both did not know what to do to end this relationship once and for all, or to continue to meet in the same format, but experienced constant psychological discomfort. They arranged a warm meeting on Valentine's Day. It was a chance to set the record straight, to forgive each other for offenses and deal with misunderstandings and understatements. As luck would have it, Marion got some unpleasant news. One of the saleswomen was sick, and there was no one to work the night shift. "Marion, but I'm begging you to come out. You'll be well paid." The manager begged her. "But I have plans for tonight." Marion replied grudgingly. Probably if the manager had known with whom Marion was going to spend the evenings then, she would certainly have looked for someone else. "I'm begging you. I'll get on my knees." "All right, Bridget, don't. I'll go out." A sense of responsibility had been instilled in her from childhood, not by her mother, not by her father, but by life. And Marion couldn't refuse to help the shop she'd been working in for over a year. Still at the end of her shift, she kept walking around, twisting and turning the phone in her hands, typing and deleting text again. For some reason it seemed to the girl that if she didn't make it, her and Stephen's relationship would be over forever. Yes, she had become a little dependent on him. She liked his advances, the fact that he was a wealthy and mature man, but most importantly, having had no experience of a really serious relationship with men before, Marion quickly got used to him. Somehow she thought that this choice was the best, and she would never get another chance to find a suitable life partner. Stephen was indeed good-looking and well-to-do, but did he love her? She didn't want to think about it, because somewhere in the back of her mind, her heart felt unreciprocated. Finally, it was 9 p.m. The second shift had begun. Marion knew she had to be at Stephen's at 9:30 p.m. She had to dare to text. "I'll write it as it is. He'll think I'm responsible. He's the boss here," Marion tried to reassure herself. She picked up her phone and looked at the screen. One new message. It was Stephen. What was he trying to tell her? Marian opened the message. "Sunshine, please forgive me. I can't make it today. I'll be in an important meeting." How easy and convenient it is, being a member of the administration, to refer to important, usually unscheduled meetings. Stephen had used his position more than once to make up another story about these very important matters, but Marian had no choice but to believe him. After all, if there was no trust, then why keep in touch with the man? She wrote him that she was also busy, that she was put on the night shift, using the warmest and sweetest words. Stephen felt sorry for his girlfriend and wished her a brisk shift. Almost 3 hours passed, there were less and less people in the shop, and thus less work too. Marian was thinking more about her personal problems than about customer requests and groceries. It was unusual for her to work after 9 o'clock, and she was beginning to feel a little drowsy. There was a sudden appearance. Scarlett appeared in the shop, the same sickly shop assistant. Marian was a little puzzled. What was she to do now? "Marian, hi. It's okay, I can do it. I'm free," the woman said. "Yes, but Bridget." I rang. Marian shrugged. She went to the back room to change. She hated to humiliate herself in front of Stephen, but his flat was the only place close to the shop where she could spend the night. She realized he had no intention of seeing her. He might already be asleep or out of the house, but it was still better than catching a taxi in a foreign city past midnight. Maybe he'll at least pay for my taxi, she thought. As it happened, Marian had hardly any money with her, and she certainly wouldn't have enough for the ride home. After 3 messages asking for a bed for the night, or at least for help, Marian began to call Stephen, but all her efforts were in vain. He must have been very busy. She stepped outside, breathed the fresh February air into her chest, and headed for the bus stop. There are times when you know you're doing something reckless, but you walk on, as if you're too lazy to stop, think, and make another, more difficult decision. That's what happened to Marian, who all in her thoughts walked slowly to the bus stop, knowing that all the buses had long since gone away. Marian sat down on the bench once more, checking her phone just in case. It hadn't received a single call, not a single message. Of course, she could have called one of her friends and mates, asked to borrow money and hail a taxi. She could have gone back to the shop and spent the night in the back, but her eyes fell on the very few old houses she had noticed the first time she had come here for a job interview. The houses were old and shabby, but still people lived there. Marian was sure that on the ranch there would be some old man or woman who would be kind enough to shelter her till morning and give her a good meal. At least that's what fairy tales and good films and serials about lost people teach us. She walked towards the houses. A window was burning in one of them. Without thinking long, Marian headed towards the light. She approached the wicket, in the yard of the property through the darkness. The girl saw a large foreign car that looked like an SUV. Though the wicket was closed, the hook could be easily lifted from outside the lot. Marian decided to go in to knock on the door. She reckoned that was what the locals here did. Slowly moving around the lot, she got a little look at the property. There was probably a garden under the windows. There were pegs sticking out from under the snowdrifts that looked like the planks of an ornamental fence. There were fruit trees growing close to the fence. She knocked on the door, and a man soon came knocking. "Who's there?" said a tall male voice. "I missed the bus. I don't know what to do." Well, the man said slyly. He sounded elderly. Marian saw before her a skinny old man a little taller than herself, with a long beard and sparse long hair. He was gray-haired. His thin features did not have a particularly aged look. On the contrary, there was something naive, childlike about them. The old man looked at Marian and smiled. He expected to hear her story. "I didn't catch the bus. I don't know what to do." "Aha, aha." The grandfather said fluently, "I heard that." In short, "I don't want to beat around the bush. Can I sleep over?" "Sure, come in, come in." Marian at first became frightened. Crossing the threshold of the house, she felt some hostile aura and even wanted to leave. But the old man turned and said good-naturedly, as if sensing that his manners were not to the liking of the uninvited guest, "We have only good people here, and everybody knows me, and I know everybody. Don't worry, girl. Lie down in a small room and rest until morning." The lively interest in his eyes and sly voice dissolved somewhere, and Marian became easier to communicate with this man. She remembered about the foreign car in the yard. "Do you drive?" My son drives. He comes here with his wife. This time he decided to leave it here. I don't know why. Grandpa went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and from the kitchen I heard something. Do you want something to eat? No, thanks. Well, at least store-bought cakes with tea, replied the guest. While grandfather was fussing in the kitchen, Marion began to look at his home. It was quite decent. There was a plasma TV on the bedside table, and although the furniture was simple and old-looking, the house was clean and tidy. The sofa was populated with a new bedspread of expensive fabric. It seemed as if someone was constantly caring for this dwelling, and judging by the nature of that care, it was hardly the owner. Yes, my name is Michael Taylor. An elderly man came into the living room with a plate of cakes in his hands. Marion. The girl sighed tiredly. Are you sleepy? I'll get some tea. He left again, and Marion felt her heart finally calm down and beat in a familiar rhythm. Marion ate the cakes and drank tea alone, and the master went away again. He came half an hour later and announced that the room was ready. She had gone to spend the night in a strange place, lying in a strange bed, and this moment, of course, embarrassed her. Lying under the covers, she stared at the burning screen of her phone. Such a strange thing was happening to her. She wanted to share her impressions with at least someone, but then she realized, who should I write to? And having put the phone on the bedside table, she fell asleep in the sound sleep of a baby. Tired and spiritually distressed for the day, Marion decided to get out of bed as soon as her eyes opened for the first time that morning. Despite Michael Taylor's apparent hospitality and kindness, she felt uncomfortable being in someone else's home. She glanced at the clock on her phone, 5:27 a.m. Getting up at this hour was certainly difficult, but still Marion made an effort on herself. If I pack quickly, I can catch the bus, she thought. Marion sat down on the edge of the bed and stretched, slowly so as not to wake the elderly owner of the house. She tucked her phone and charger into her bag, looked in the small mirror that hung on the wall, and opened the door to the living room as carefully as she could. The landlord was apparently asleep. He was lying on the sofa, covered with a plaid, with his back to the exit. A few steps separated the girl from the exit. She paused. Maybe I should thank him. At least say something. No, I won't make the bus. She turned towards the door and continued her slow step. After a few seconds, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It couldn't be anyone else. Marion turned around. A satisfied Michael Taylor stood in front of her with a sly smile that pushed her away, still last night. It wasn't as if the man had just woken up. It was as if he had been invisibly watching his guest since the moment she awoke. Marion became frightened. She was a truly desperate girl at times, and yet she was the weaker sex. And there was a strange man standing in front of her, and this man was clearly not going to let her go. Michael now seemed stronger, taller, and more confident to her. Were these sensations contrived from fear, or had the master, all the time the girl had been in his possession, been trying to appear feeble, bending and grimacing to make Marion believe he was pitying her? She did not know, but it was urgent to get out of this house and not make a mess of things. Darling, where are you going? And who's going to pay for it? He gave his victim a sly look. Look, I'm going to leave now. I have no money, but I'll pay you back. Now I can. Marion began to dig frantically in her bag to find her purse. She pulled it out and took out several 100 notes. Hashim, the old man chuckled softly. Do you have a phone number? I'll text it to you or your son. Here's 400. Put the money away. Breathing heavily, Michael said. The elderly owner abruptly sat down and began to pull off the girl her dark, tight skirt, which she had decided to wear the day before, as February had been warm and sunny lately. Marion immediately began to struggle with the rascal. She tried for his shoulders to push him away from her, but he pressed himself against her, wrapping his arms around her legs. Marion felt as if she were falling. They lay struggling for a while. Michael slapped Marion on the cheek. Shut up and obey, or you'll get in trouble. I'll say you attacked the old man. Marion didn't expect that this man could be so dangerous and strong. She started to scream, and he immediately put his hand over her mouth. Feeling that he had little strength to completely defeat the girl, Michael began to beat her mercilessly on the face, trying to suppress her will, but he did not know that Marion had in her soul so strong an undisclosed anger that only give the will to show itself and terrible things would happen. This anger was like a sleeping bear that had been teased by people. The more they irritate him, the stronger his desire to tear his offenders, and only the cage separates fools from death. Unfortunately for Michael Taylor, a lusty old man who thought of raping a girl in unpleasant circumstances in the middle of the night, Marion was a warrior in her 22 years. She herself didn't fully know what she was capable of. The blows to her face had pissed her off, and she no longer saw the lonely old man in front of her as a monster and a murderer. Marion bit into his neck, and he loosened his grip a little and groaned. Still, it wasn't working to break free from his tight embrace. Michael continued to beat his victim. At some point, she felt sick to her stomach and decided that this was the end. She was ready for violence to stay alive. Her skirt was almost off. The scumbag was already fumbling with her underwear. Marion could not stand this nightmare. She suddenly screamed so frantically that Michael was just in a daze and finally let her get free. It seemed to run free, call people for help, but this feeling couldn't stop. It was charged and demanded some sort of outlet. Marion, strangely enough, in defiance of the sense of self-preservation she had had until a few minutes ago, took a sharp step towards the kitchen. From there she picked up the heaviest-looking utensil, a cast-iron skillet, and dashed into the room. Before she realized it, Michael was lifting himself up on his hands to get up, but he was still sitting on the floor. He instantly became the victim, not the hunter. Terrified, the old man looked at the furious girl with the frying pan and only had time to open his mouth, probably preparing an exculpatory speech, pitying words to be pitied and spared, but it was not to be. A blow, another blow, and he fell to the floor, sprawled on it senseless. Marion didn't know if her attacker was still alive, but she immediately called an ambulance and the police. She sat at her desk in a small armchair beside the body of her failed rapist and propped her cheek with the palm of her hand. Thoughts of criminal responsibility began to cross her mind. At 16, when she was still at school, she'd been interested in the law for a while. At home, there was a thick book on the shelves called Legislation. At first, Marion just opened and closed it, and then for fun began to learn by heart the names of articles and their numbers. The number 105 came to mind. Would I get 105 or not? Would I have a chance of not going to jail? This is self-defense. Marion was not sure that she would not be given the article for murder, but she was more inclined to manslaughter. In any case, the girl was scared, because in front of her, perhaps there was a corpse of a man and an elderly man, and she was in someone else's house. Marion went to the mirror. Her face was already beginning to show signs of beatings, and that was to her advantage. She calmed down a bit, sat back in her chair, and continued to wait for the police and ambulance. Finally, after half an hour, Marion waited for the one she had been anxiously awaiting. It was still dark outside, and the people of the neighboring houses must have been asleep, but on hearing the noise of the cars, the gawkers hurried out from behind their fences, and there were those who formed a large crowd around Michael Taylor's property. Murdered my granddad, the bastards, thieves, I suppose. He'd been giving up lately. These and many other phrases from the gawkers could be heard by ambulance and police officers. "What happened?" shouted a woman from the crowd. "We're looking into it," replied the paramedic briefly. People wanted the truth. They were eager to know it. They couldn't just leave the place and wait for the first rumors from the most clever neighbors in the area. Michael Taylor was generally well regarded by the people, though he had not lived here long. Most people thought he was a peaceful and quiet grandfather, cared for at times by his son and daughter-in-law. The police asked Marion a few questions, to which she answered as honestly as possible, believing there was nothing to hide, and concealment of the facts of what had happened, as she knew, was punishable by law. The girl was put into a police car, and as she walked along, accompanied by two men in uniform, people stared at her in silence. When she got into the car, people started whispering among themselves again. What a nightmare. These young people have gone, shouted someone from the crowd. A little later, the doctors finished their work and carried out an elderly man on a stretcher. His face was not covered, and the villagers, seeing this, breathed a sigh of relief. The police had left, the ambulance had left, forensic experts had rushed to the scene. There was nothing to see here, as they were mostly inside the house. People went to their homes to sleep, and some people went about their daily business. The women, who were particularly impressionable, could not recover from what they had seen for a long time. They became afraid for their own lives. Nothing illegal had ever happened in this area, and no one, of course, did not expect that a murderer would come to the quiet place where mostly pensioners lived. A little later, grandparents began to go to each other and discuss what had happened. Some were even pleased that something worthwhile could finally be discussed. Barbara stopped by to see her friend Vanessa. "Vanessa, did you hear? Did you see what happened? Everyone's alive, old people are being slaughtered. Why, what was Michael's problem?" "Yeah, I saw and heard. I was standing there this morning." "What do they say?" "She's a young girl." "She was young, but the weird thing is, she called the police and the ambulance." "Wait, what are you doing?" Barbara glared at her friend. "You're justifying her." "She's not here. I'm just saying it's weird. They're all bastards. They don't spare us old people. She came in, she wanted money, she wanted to make a profit, and Michael turned her down." "Yeah, I guess that's what happened." Prejudice was firmly planted in the woman's mind. She couldn't imagine anyone making excuses for someone who'd done grievous bodily harm to an elderly man. Not she. No one else in the area wanted to think that Michael Taylor was at fault, even though everyone knew that the girl had not run away but had stayed at his house until the police and ambulance arrived. And everyone knew about the oddities of the grandfather living at the entrance to the village. Marion was young and healthy, her victim, on the contrary, elderly and weak. And who would have thought that he wanted to rape his overnight guest, who out of desperation had risked spending the night with one of the residents of this ill-fated neighborhood? The investigation began. Michael was still in intensive care, but the doctors gave him a positive prognosis. Marion recounted all the details. She indicated the approximate time of events, talked about the nuances, answered all the questions put to her. In general, actively cooperated with the investigation, and the investigators saw that she was sincere, and her eyes were burning with the desire to get out of the detention center as soon as possible, to be acquitted. It was not only her unenviable position that marred Marion. Perhaps even more unpleasant was the fact that during her 5 days in the detention center she had never been contacted. There had been no messages or calls from either her mother or Stephen. Marion had wanted to call them both several times, but had hesitated. Something kept her from doing so. She wanted to be interested and waited for the call. So she felt that besides anxious thoughts about her future fate, she had other worries on her mind. And though they were not good either, yet in this way the girl was able to dilute her fear a little. Marion realized that she needed a good lawyer, and she still couldn't stand it. And while the investigation was dragging on and Michael had not yet come to his senses, it was worth worrying about her defense. After 5 days in the detention center, she called Stephen and told him everything. "Really, why didn't you call before?" he asked in confusion. "I was hoping you would call." Stephen had nothing to reply to these words. He really hadn't been concerned about her all these 5 days. Marion had only called the shop manager, and Marion thought that she might have told the others about her trouble. But to her surprise, her beloved Stephen knew nothing. "Do you need a lawyer?" he asked Marion. "Yes, I'm ashamed to ask for your help, but if you don't, no one will. Tell me, didn't you defend yourself?" "Yes, I told everything to the investigation. Why such questions, Stephen?" Marion experienced emotional tension and was even annoyed when she heard the words of doubt from Stephen. He hurriedly reassured her. "Marion, it's okay, calm down. At least come and check on me. The lawyer will be you in which detention center you are sitting." Marion told him the number of the detention center. When she hung up, she realized that he didn't even want to visit her. He was evasive. Marion never called her mother. Somehow she wasn't particularly surprised by this. Disinterest in her daughter's life was a trait that had characterized Kimberly almost all her life. She had always regarded the girl as an obligation. And now, after a week without hearing from her, she concluded that she would come forward sooner or later. But if she is in distress, this important question was absent from the mother's mind in grief. "Morris, you have a visitor." Marion heard from the guard. A lawyer had come to see her, and her first question to him was, "Who are you from?" Stephen had not lied. He had sent his man to her, and he was ready to take up her case seriously and intimately. Mr. Christopher immediately reassured the defendant. "It's not a difficult case, just tell it like it is." Marion sighed, having to recall again the terrible story of the lustful owner of the house on the edge of the city. After about 20 minutes of careful listening, Mr. Christopher, a thin man, brunette, glasses, with a concentrated face, crossed his palms and moved a little closer to the accused. "You've done well. This is all very important. I think we're going to win this case." "I'd like to believe that." Shaking her head slightly, sadly, looking somewhere away, Marion said, You know, by the way, that our Michael Taylor is already in the ward. Awake, will soon testify. A strong color stuck to Marian's face. She was frightened. This must be bad. Believe me, I have a lot of experience in these cases. He won't make it. Of course he'll tell his stories. It's a very good thing you're left with a clear beating. You have no motive. You stayed at the scene of the crime. Nothing was stolen. You can just calm down and wait for the exit. Mr. Christopher collected his papers in his briefcase, and after saying goodbye and wishing Marian patience, he left. Dad, what's wrong? Well, you tell me, come on. A large, tall man in shirt and trousers almost ran into the room. He looked about 40 years old and was in an agitated state. How did they let you in, quarantine? The grandfather looked at his son in surprise. Dad, they let me in, and let me in. The man sat down on a chair near his father's bed. He looked at him patiently, waiting for some explanation of what had happened. Why, you don't know anything yourself, lawyer. Dad, I know everything. I want to hear you. Is she some kind of psychopath? She didn't even take anything. She wanted to kill me. Michael got up from the bed in a state of near rage. Well, calm down, Dad, calmed his son, gently put his hands on his shoulders. Lie down, rest if you want. Let's not talk about it now. No, you started it. I'll continue. Sadist, she wanted to kill me. How do I know why? Michael Taylor was clearly in a bad mood. His son Edward was determined to derail the conversation. In between asking him questions about his health, about the hospital kitchen and the doctors, he decided that he would have to come again when his father had calmed down and was ready to talk about what had happened in his home without emotion. For Marian, the time spent in the isolation ward dragged on at a terribly slow pace. Mr. Christopher had failed to fully convince her that her actions would qualify as self-defense. Some uncomfortable feeling could not leave her, as if everything was not so simple in this case. On the eve of the hearing, Mr. Christopher once again went to see his client. He was in high spirits and simply confident of victory. Marian, don't worry, everything will be fine. Tomorrow be sure and say everything as you told me. You were in agitation, plus self-defense, attempted rape. That'll put our Michael Taylor in jail, Marian's lawyer said with a smile on his face. The convict was silent for most of this conversation, just nodding and occasionally speaking. I see. The closer the trial got, the more anxious she felt. The night before the trial, Marian remembered her mother, brother, and sister. She had a strange feeling that the family had a life of its own, and that they were not her own people. Little by little, she began to involuntarily forget their images and memories associated with the house. The trial began in the morning. Marian prepared herself for the trial. She had her hair combed and even put on a little makeup and wore a clean change of clothes that she had taken with her to the detention center. She looked like a normal, decent, and civilized girl. The image at the trial had to play a positive role. In her case, it was important. Many had already labeled Marian a dangerous criminal, a marginal, and a thief. There were rumors that Michael was not the first victim of the killer, and that she dealt exclusively with lonely pensioners. But this time she had a serious client. Everyone in the area knew of Marian's blunder. Marian sat behind the bar and watched the people entering the hall. She said hello to Mr. Christopher, and he once again cheered her up by saying, "It's going to be fine." Marian Morris. Some of Michael's neighbors came in. Marian hadn't seen them, of course, and wouldn't remember them, but they were elderly people, outwardly different from the city folk, and she concluded that it was Michael's support group that had come. She saw him too, but immediately looked away. He still disgusted her. Sitting next to him was apparently his lawyer, a tall, statuesque man in his mid-40s. The most unexpected thing for the defendant happened when a woman and her teenage son, who were very familiar to her, entered the courtroom. It was Kimberly and Jack, Marian's mother and brother. She stared at them for a long moment, wonderingly trying to meet her mother's gaze. Jack waved his hand to his sister, but her mother immediately cut him off. She did not look at her daughter, feeling that she was looking at her. Why did she come here? And with Jack thought Marian. The hearing of the case began. When Michael's lawyer introduced himself to Marian, she turned pale. His last name was Taylor, the same as her abuser's. She stared at his face, then shifted her gaze to the victim. Yes, they did look alike. Was it really his relative? His son Marian no longer expected anything good from this trial. Though her defender, Mr. Christopher, looked quite confident in his statement, but when his opponent began his speech, he began to listen carefully to his words. The speech was filled with complex language, and everyone with a little knowledge of the law realized that this man was serious and knew his case well. Many were also struck by the emotionality with which he spoke about the case. Especially attentive guessed what was the reason for such an ardent concern of the lawyer to the old victim, who risked to become the accused that day. Alas, it did not happen. Against all sound logic, against Mr. Christopher's efforts, and against all the facts that had been presented to the court, Marion was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for robbery. Hearing the judge's words, Mr. Christopher's face changed. What assault? He addressed the judge so that no one could hear him. What's the matter with you? Mr. Christopher, sit down and calm down. You'll appeal if you have to. The judge answered him calmly. The man looked shattered. He had lost, a rare event in his 20 years of practice. Marion saw the bailiffs as they approached. She watched Mr. Christopher's face, hoping he would look at her, though she didn't know why she wanted to make contact with him. He stood gloomily for a moment in one place, and pretending to be so puzzled that he had forgotten Marion, walked slowly towards the exit. Mr. Christopher, what now? Marion shouted. The bailiffs had already entered the defendant's cell, the girl's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Christopher disappeared into the crowd of spectators leaving the hall. Marion was still in the detention center for some time. She kept waiting for Stephen's call, still unwilling to accept the fact that she would soon be a prisoner. Maybe they'll reconsider, appeal, she thought, sitting within the 4 walls of this horrible room she was never supposed to enter. Finally, Marion got a phone call. It was her young man, though she wasn't sure anymore. His voice was initially depressed, and that didn't bode well for Marion. Well, what is it? In a pleading voice, she asked. Yes, Marion, you see, Mr. Christopher is a very good lawyer. I paid him a lot. He didn't expect this, you know. The thing is, this Edward, he's the freak's son. But not only that. What else? He's a powerful lawyer. I heard that Michael, this weirdo in there with them, did not want to live with them in the city. Wanted to his native village, where he grew up. All these long summarizations were not only unnecessary for Marion, but also irritating. Unable to bear it any longer, she asked Stephen. Why are you telling me all this? Is it bad or not? Marion, I don't have that much money. Mr. Christopher told me the amount, but it's a lot too. Others will take even more. And this one is an acquaintance. How much, Stephen? Marion asked, almost crying. Well, 1 million. We, of course, on friendly terms agreed that half of the amount in case of loss he will return. But you know, 100,000,000 I cannot get nowhere. But it's just 1 million. Stephen, I'm going down, you know. There was an uncomfortable silence at both ends of the wire. Stephen kept silent because he didn't want to offend or upset the girl. Marion said nothing. She waited for his final answer. Marion, finally softly spoke Stephen. Well, first of all, it is a colony of settlement. It is not strict regime, and secondly, well, 5 years and parole. I'm sure you will go out on parole. These words were too horrible for Marion. She hung up the phone. Marion, hello. On this day, Territorial Superintendent Stephen Howard decided to take no further interest in this girl's life. When she tried to call him for help and made her most fatal and possibly stupid decision of her life to go to a sleepover with a stranger, he was having a great time with a nice lady who had been waiting for reciprocation from him for a long time. Lately, Stephen had been unsure of his feelings for the young and simple girl Marion, because one way or another he was influenced by the opinion of those around him. He was independent and had no authority, but one day he himself thought that he felt uncomfortable in the company of a shop girl, or maybe he just took and changed because people change. Marion Morris, a 24-year-old shop assistant at a grocery shop chain. The girl, circumstances that one day did not work out in her favor, went to the colony. At first she was scared, but fortunately in the colony of settlement lived, and quite decent, not broken by prison women. It was to such women that the newcomer tried to get closer. Still, sometimes she had to show her teeth here. Like in the men's prison, this colony had its own chief or pahanka. Her name was Jennifer, and this was the 4th time she had been here. One had to respect this imposing woman with a not very feminine tattoo on her arm. There were always a few female settlers walking beside her like jackals. All of these women were unpleasant in appearance. From their appearance, you could roughly determine their articles. One was a thief with experience. Another killed her husband in another drunkenness. But Jennifer herself, already in the fourth time, caught in a major fraud. She began her dirty career with an assistant to a serious businessman and part-time criminal mastermind of the city, and it was back in the 90s. Young Jennifer liked to live life to the fullest, and even after the first walk, she decided not to stop there and become even more successful. Except that the woman never wanted to earn according to conscience. She had no children, no husbands, and somewhere in her hometown remained an unhappy mother. Not long ago, who learned from neighbors about the criminal biography of her daughter, Jennifer all told her that she went abroad for a long time, and she piously believed her and even rejoiced for her in anticipation of seeing her only beloved daughter again. But through one of her neighbors, the truth was accidentally revealed. It was before Jennifer's last conviction. She and her mother had had a terrible fight, and in her heart, her daughter called her some very nasty words and left. A few weeks later, she had another case she wanted to drop because it was quite a risky move, but remembering the difficult conversation with her mother, she decided, okay, nobody needs me here anyway. And again, Jennifer and several of her partners had to go to jail for fraud. Marion was settling in. It wasn't so bad. She found something new to do here. She started sewing often, even when her working hours were over. She was also fond of beading, and this activity calmed her and temporarily removed all bad thoughts from her head. Somewhere in the sewing room on a shelf there was a magazine with weaving schemes. That afternoon Marion studied it and asked one of the inmates, the shop manager, to get some beads so that she could make crafts from the magazine. Margaret, the supervisor's name, was a kind and understanding person, and to Marion's delight, in a couple of days she brought her a large amount of material for her new creation. Her meditations, sitting on her bunk and threading the little balls on the thread one by one, Marion began to forget all her troubles, enjoying her work, which almost from the beginning she had been doing well. Interrupting her positive thoughts, 4 women entered the cell. Jennifer was among them. Marion was afraid of this bulky woman, partly because she almost never walked alone, and many colonists had told of her cruelty. Jennifer looked at Marion with a contemptuous smile, who pretended not to notice the women who had entered the room. But how could she not notice them? "What are you doing in business, new girl?" Marion's plowwoman asked impudently. Realizing from Jennifer's tone that she did not come in peace, Marion decided not to answer anything. "I made up a nickname for her, Beads," shouted one of Jennifer's 6. All but the main one appreciated her friend's joke and laughed too. It was an unpleasant sight. These ladies were clearly out of the local color of the colony, which in general was not so bad. "All right, I'm not supposed to be quiet around here. Last name, first name." Jennifer spoke. "Marion Morris." Marion put her work aside and looked at the woman. The newcomer's eyes were full of a confidence uncommon to newcomers, and a kind of desperate insolence, which was of course bad form for someone like her. "Are you so bold?" Jennifer asked in surprise. Marion again made no reply, thinking the colonist's behavior a provocation. Her behavior offended the unspoken leader of the colony. "Well, I hear you've been weaving your stuff around here, that you've started selling it, but that's not the way it works. So 80% of your shit is coming to me. Look, it'll be under control." Marion remained stubbornly silent. She picked up her weave and continued working as if they had all left the cell. "Have you learnt everything?" No, Marion answered. "But then, now the girls will crush you a little." And for a few moments Jennifer waited. She hoped that Marion, under the pressure of the threat, would agree to her unprofitable business plan. But alas, she gave her friends a gesture, and they began to approach Marion. A fight broke out. Jennifer, as former prisoners, calculated everything. Almost no one was in the building of the colony. All went to community service. The administration was usually eating lunch at this time, and there were no guards here to monitor the prisoners. Marion didn't scream for help. She wasn't the tiniest girl, but she had never been in a fight before. She reckoned that this was her first time as well, for against Michael she was rather just defending herself. Of course she couldn't do it against 3 men, but she remembered the feeling of overwhelming rage she had felt when the man responsible for her mangled fate had touched her underwear. Jennifer's girls had had it. For one ended with a broken nose, for another with a black eye and a nail-scarred cheek. Still, Marion was beaten. She lay on the floor, holding her stomach. It only hurt, but surprisingly she did not feel fear. resentment, or despair that day or later. Marion lay on the floor for some time, beaten by the felons, though she was able to get up. Then she crawled quietly from the floor to her bunk and put her hands on her head. She thought about her future fate in this place. Jennifer, strangely enough, had stopped pestering the needlewoman who had appeared in the colony and had told her own not to hurt her either. "Morris, don't touch her. She's a hard woman of ours. I heard that she wanted to kill the old man who was bothering her," she told the girls. The colony's chief gangster even developed a certain sympathy for this young prisoner with a beautiful and rare name. Marion worked exclusively for herself, giving her trinkets to the girls and women with whom she most often socialized, or even selling them. One day, one of the prison authorities took an interest in her work, and that's how Marion got her first big money in prison. The work was painstaking, but the necklace of pink flowers came out simply amazing, and all in joy the customer paid her $2,000 for her hard work. Soon Marion decided to follow the example of some other women from the colony who had been in captivity for a long time and were beginning to go mad from the monotony of their lives. Some of them also began to weave beads, and some of them sewed clothes from patterns, and there were also those who simply embroidered cross-stitch, so to speak, for the soul. "And you have brought creativity into our society. Look, everyone is doing something. Lillian sits all day long and embroiders her flowers." "Yes, I can see it's fun," Marion smiled. Linda was the nicest person she had ever met. She was not only interesting to talk to, but also to share her feelings. This prisoner had a feeling of caring for Marion and her fate. She was the first to hear the story of the lustful old man from whom she had to defend herself. At first, Marion's story shocked her, and she could not calm down for a long time, asking her friend about the case, whether it was possible to appeal against the court decision, and whether there were people ready to fight for her. Then, having learnt that the girl had a bigger problem in her free life than her criminal record, namely the complete indifference of all her relatives and acquaintances, including her mother, Linda calmed down and stopped asking her uncomfortable questions and just sympathized with her. A year passed. No one had visited Marion once during that time. At first, listening to stories of women about how their visits with their mother, with their son, with their husband had gone, she became sad and even at times wanted to cry. Then she got used to this pain and dissolved in her daily activities. So in beading, community service, socializing with good girls from the colony, and thinking about life after prison, 2 more years passed unnoticed. Marion turned 27 years old. She was young, beautiful, and forced to sit in jail only because she had prevented a lusty old man from being abused. A few days after her birthday, which she celebrated in a tight circle of good friends, Linda among them, she was summoned to the office of the colony director. Marion was terrified and told Linda about the event. "Yes, wait, why are you nervous?" Linda hurried to calm her friend. "I don't know, what if I did something wrong? Maybe it's because of the sale of their products." "Well, you told me that Cheryl Jones ordered something from you." "Yeah, that's why it's weird. I've been trying to remember for 3 years, and I can't figure out where I went wrong." "Look, what makes you think it's something bad? What's good?" Marion grinned nervously. The girl, even though she liked the life in captivity lately, she was counting the days until she left the colony. She had only 2 years left, and again she could live as a human being in freedom. However, thinking about it a little deeper, she began to get a little upset. "I'll get out, but what then? Where to go? I won't go to my mom. I won't go to Stephen, but he won't expect me." Marion knew that she would have to look for a job and a place to live. And these thoughts burdened her, and yet Marion looked forward to freedom. Like most of the women in the colony who'd come here, some for robbery, some for theft, and some like her by coincidence by life's injustices. She walked slowly to her boss's office, fearing not only bad news from him, but illegal actions. Now, after the incident with Michael, she was afraid of strange men, and willy-nilly in ambiguous situations the girl was frightened. She became uncomfortable and frightened. "Marion Morris, why are you standing there?" "I'm waiting for you." The headmaster, a man in his 50s with a full head of gray, looked out of the office. "Hello," Marion replied briefly. William Butler, that was the name of the director of the colony, politely asked the prisoner to sit down. As she entered the office, she immediately noticed the woman sitting at the large desk to the left of the director's desk. Now she was no longer so afraid of William Butler. The woman was Amanda Hill, a social worker who had worked with the female prisoners here for a long time, and she had a kind face. The colonists loved Amanda. Yes, she could not solve all the burning questions of her wards, but she always sincerely tried to help people in their trouble. And just a personal conversation with her was sometimes a balm to the soul of these women. Amanda had no children, and she seemed to give all her motherly love to them. "Marion Morris, how are you enjoying your stay in our institution, so to speak?" William Butler chuckled slightly at his own words, shifting his gaze from Marion to the teacher. "It's fine, I like it." Marion was startled, and it was noticeable. "Marion Morris, can I ask why you're so tense right now?" Amanda addressed the prisoner. "I'm worried," Marion replied. "Why should you be worried?" Smiled William Butler, who, according to Marion's findings, had been a lively and cheerful man that day. There was silence. William Butler was staring at some papers. Perhaps it was a file on the prisoner Morris. Amanda Hill was careful not to let Marion notice her gaze. "All right, ladies, well, Marion Morris, your lawyer, Mr. Christopher, has filed a motion with the court for your parole." "How?" Marion was surprised. "Didn't you know anything?" "No." Marion was confused. Stephen hadn't reported in for 3 years. Was it Mr. Christopher's own initiative? She could not believe that she might be able to get out of the colony early. The prisoner's face changed visibly. She was radiant with joy, but she tried not to show it and listened attentively to William Butler. "So you talk to Amanda and she'll tell you everything. There'll be a medical examination soon, mind you, and then the trial. In general, I've written you the most positive characteristic, because we here with comrades know about your hobbies, that you sew there, or beadwork, you're about to do it, and that you have a positive influence on the inmates of the colony. In general, the main thing is not to worry and believe in the best. So the court will decide." Marion asked anxiously. "Yes, the court will decide everything, but we are for you." Marion thanked William Butler for the good news, and together with Amanda they went out to talk. As they wandered around the large colony grounds, they chatted about the parole process. Marion asked the educator with great interest about how it would go and what she herself had to do to be granted parole. At night before she went to bed, she was full of bright new impressions and thought of Mr. Christopher. Why did he help her? Marion was quite sure that the man had already forgotten her and that unpleasant case. It had been a long time since she had thought of him, but as it turned out, he not only remembered, but was willing to help her. The medical board found no reason to deny Morris parole. A little later, a hearing was held in the local court, where the only familiar face in the room this time was Mr. Christopher. The hearing was quick and successful. The result was the granting of the application for conditional early release of the convict under the article robbery, which meant that in 10 days, young, beautiful, and still not broken, believing in the best, Marion Morris was waiting for her long-awaited freedom. She already knew about it from the words of ex-criminals who had once been released on parole. It was the beginning of March. Although the whole earth was still covered with snow, and in general in nature there were almost no signs of spring, Marion felt it with all her body and with all her soul. She wanted to shout, "Freedom!" But the girl's quiet disposition prevented her from doing so. She stood for some time near the high fence with barbed wire, smoking and greedily gulping the air, which this day seemed much sweeter than before. Well, Marion went to her hometown, and this time she had money with her, and there she rented a place to live. In this she was helped by one of her acquaintances, with whom they had established good contacts while Marion was still in the colony. They began to communicate even more often than before. No one helped Marion with work. She soon found a job as a saleswoman at a cash register. The problems of the former prisoner began almost immediately after the beginning of life on the outside. It was not bad, and Marion liked it very much. A fresh start, perhaps, so she imagined her future fate when she was behind bars. But a couple of weeks later, a manager approached her at work when she was putting the goods on the shelves. "Marion, can I have a word with you?" "Yes, say it right here." "What are you talking about?" Marion asked, engrossed in her work. "Marion, it won't work here. It's important." They both went outside. The weather was fine. It was April, and it was even hot at times. "Marion, you see, today I was told from above. They say that you do not meet the qualification requirements here." The manager was very embarrassed. It was hard for her to inform this hard-working girl, who from the very first days of her work in this small grocery shop began to show enthusiasm and professionalism. that she was fired. "I see I don't fit in." Marion grinned. "Marion, what can I do?" "I was told to tell you." "Yeah, it's all about the criminal record. I know it's not your fault." Even though Marion was depressed that day, she knew there was no point in trying so hard to please the manager. She finished the day perfectly, without any complaints. "I'm sorry to see you go," her boss told her as she walked her out the next day. Marion just smiled sadly and walked to the bus stop with a cigarette. She smoked more and more often and worried about her future fate. It was an unpleasant day for Marion. She realized that she had no money to pay her rent and no success in finding a new job. She didn't want to be a beggar to her mother, but she decided to visit her family, at least to see her brother Jack and sister Cassandra. She stood for a long time in front of the windows of her home, hesitating to enter. It was her pride. In 3 years, her mother had never once bothered to find out about her. How could it be? Suddenly, her mind was full of different thoughts. What if something had happened to her? What if Marion, horrified at her own reasoning, went with a quick step into the flat? It was late in the evening. Everyone must be at home, and she rang the doorbell. It was Marion. She answered briefly to the sound of the inner door opening. A male, unfamiliar voice was heard in the distance. Another minute of fussing outside the door, and she was opened. "Marion, what are you doing here so early?" It was not a joke. It was a real misunderstanding on her mother's part, and Marion did not know whether to laugh or cry. In simple words, she was not welcome here. She walked to the living room. Her sister Cassandra was sitting there watching cartoons. Is it really her, Marion thought. The girl was all grown up, had grown-up features. Marion. Cassandra broke away from the TV series and ran up to her older sister. Marion couldn't contain her emotions. She took the girl in her arms, even though she was already overweight, and spun her around a little in front of her. "Cassandra, have you grown so big? You're 13, aren't you?" "Wow. I'm 13. And you're 20? Marion stared at her sister. Then her face turned from surprise to full of joyful emotion, and she laughed. "Cassandra, are you doing well in maths?" "How much?" Marion wondered. "I won't tell you." An unfamiliar man entered the room. He reluctantly said hello to his guest. Matthew. Matthew was tall and broad-shouldered and looked to be about 50 years old. Marion. "Nice to meet you. I'm your mother's husband." "I see." Marion replied quietly. Also, a lot had changed here, but not her mother's attitude towards her. "Mum, where's Jack?" Marion asked her mother at the table. They had all sat down to supper. "Jack lives alone now, not far from here. Would you like the address?" "Yes, of course." "Are you going to sleep over?" "No," said Marion modestly. "Come on. Where would you go at night? Do you have a place to stay or not?" Kimberly tried to be a bit of a caring mother, but she was not very good at it, and it didn't last long. The housemates persuaded Marion to stay the night and prepared a cot with clean linen. Before going to bed, Kimberly visited her daughter and they chatted about the detention. Marion talked about the future and the good lawyer, Mr. Christopher. And then her mother, for the umpteenth time in this life, upset her. "Marion," said gently and quietly to Kimberly, "I beg you very much, don't pretend to live here. Matthew and I are living so well. Jack has moved out. I'm finally happy. You understand me as a woman." "Mum," said Marion, "I'm not claiming anything." And that was the end of the conversation. They said goodnight to each other, and then Marion packed her things and left. Before leaving, her mother wanted to slip some note into her pocket. It was only $500, but Marion grinned sweetly, handed the money back and said, "Leave it. It's more important to you." She looked at Cassandra, who was as always staring at the television, even though the day was just beginning and she didn't even notice that Marion was leaving. The touching feeling she had for her was still there. She was a little sister, but Marion realized that everyone here would always be a stranger to her, and 13-year-old Cassandra was becoming more and more like her mother, losing her naive and childlike image. "Cassandra, at least go say goodbye to Marion." The girl reluctantly started and walked towards the corridor, all looking back at the TV screen. "Well, Cassandra, goodbye." Marion walked wherever she was going. She was only paying a month in advance, which meant that in a week or so she would have to move out due to not being able to pay for the room. She just wanted to wander around her hometown. Tears came to her at one point as she thought of her mother's words to her the night before. Marion hadn't been lying when she said she didn't need a place to live. She herself did not want to live in a flat with a strange man and a man who would never be her family, who was only nominally so. Mother, who is this? Is it only worth giving birth to be called by that great sacred word? The last bright idea of family was disappearing in the girl's soul. She was at liberty, but she had neither work nor lodging, and there was absolutely nowhere to go. Stephen, the last time they had seen each other was a long time ago. It was early February, a whole 3 years ago. Back then, their relationship had come to a head and ended without announcement because Marion had gone to juvie. He was relatively young, good-looking, and successful. I don't stand a chance, thought Marion as she sat in her room, listening to the occasional scandalous yelling coming from the next room. It was late in the evening. Without deciding anything, she went to bed. In the morning, having filtered all her thoughts and considerations overnight, Marion decided to go to Stephen's. She wasn't counting on anything, just financial help. He had helped her with her lawyer after all, and you could say, albeit indirectly, he had been involved in her parole. Perhaps he would give her some money for the first time, and that was fine with the ex-convict, who was practically at the bottom of her life. She wrote him a short message. It's Varia. I'm free. You don't be afraid of me. I'm still the same. Tomorrow I'll be outside the shop at the Forest Cafe at 8. Marion was waiting for him at the table, drinking coffee. He was on time. He didn't have to wait a minute. From even farther away he smiled and pronounced, "Well, here we meet at last." Marion didn't hear anything, but smiled too and waved at him. "Yes, I see you, hello." The man hugged his acquaintance warmly and sat down opposite. "How are you?" asked Marion. "Yes, better than anyone else. I went even higher." "Wow, and what are you now?" "Yeah, I'm a regional manager. We don't just have New York locations anymore. We have Chicago, Florida, and Washington, D.C. now. So they're all over the place. Luckily, I was here yesterday and I'm here today. I'll be somewhere else tomorrow." "Wow." Marion was surprised. "You're doing great." "Just a little." Stephen smiled satisfactorily, full of pride. "I congratulate you on this event." "Thanks, but what about you?" "Got a place to live? Got a job?" "Well, it's hard right now. I couldn't even get a job at a grocery store." "I don't know, I'll keep looking." "And housing?" "I've been living in a flat for the last week." She sighed heavily and sadly. "What's wrong, Marion?" Stephen asked gently. "I don't want to be a beggar, but I'm in a bad situation." "Come on, Marion, we always help our own. I'll put 1,100 on your card for the first time. If you have any problems, just ask." Marion was glad that at least someone on this earth was not indifferent to her difficult situation. She had become accustomed to hardship, not wanting to live at the expense of others, and the money Stephen had given her she saw simply as salvation. No longer did she want to use it. Sitting in a cafe, she saw the ring on his finger and realized he was married. Stephen probably had children by now as well. He was a little different from his old self. He didn't have that lightness, and he spoke to her in a polite, decent way, leaving no hint at the end of the evening of any further development of the relationship. He was also a stranger to her, and yet she was grateful to him for another rescue. Standing on the balcony of her new accommodation, which she had paid for 2 months in advance, now feeling relatively stable, Marion smoked and enjoyed the cool late April day. She was determined. "I'll look for a job and I'll find one, but people. Who do I need? Self has me." She raised her head high, closed her eyes, and through the small slit of her thin lips, slowly the thick cigarette smoke seeped out. The summer came. Marion found a job. She was hired at a beauty parlor, cleaning the premises. She didn't just scrub the floors. The girl watched the work of masters who painted the visitors' nails, cut hair, corrected eyebrows, and applied eyelashes. In the future, Marion wanted to learn one of these professions, but to do this, it was necessary to earn money for the courses. When she had the first money, she immediately went to a needlework shop and bought a lot of beads. In the evenings, tired from scrubbing the parlor floors, Marion strung the little balls on thread, remembering her days in the colony. Strange thoughts crossed her mind. She missed those days, for in that life there were people like herself with whom she could have a heart-to-heart talk, and they wouldn't look at you as an outsider, no matter what you told them about your plight. One fine day, And it was fine, because it was a Saturday. Marion received a call from a stranger. Here we go, another divorce. Who else could it be, she thought sadly. Still, Marion answered the call. Hello, I'm listening. There was silence. Marion was about to press the red button, but then she heard a man's voice. Is this Marion? Yes, Marion, who is this? Marion, don't hang up right away. It's the man on the other end of the line was breathing heavily. He seemed to be having a hard time speaking. Tell me, who are you? Marion asked in bewilderment. I'm your dad. I have a lot to say, but don't hang up. I'm not hanging up. Calm down. Which dad is it, Marcus? No, this is your real daddy. My name is Sebastian. I was in contact with your mom, Kimberly, about 30 years ago. I'm asking you not to reject me right away. You're not living well. You need alimony. You'd better be honest with me, Marion replied resentfully, thinking that this man wanted only profit from her. We are like that, replied the man cheerfully. Well, I'm for honesty. No one needs me in this life, Papa, and I have no money, and I have no home. I have nothing and nobody. Yes, I know, but I have everything, but I have no one to share it with. You're the only one I've got. Well, will you come visit me in Florida? Where? Marion asked me. I live in Florida. I have my own business here. I know your mom a little bit. So I told her, like you, that I have nothing. I'm starving. I need help. She told me about you too. She said let her provide for you, but I knew you were my daughter. Anyway, it's not a phone conversation. I'll send you my address. Come and talk to me. Marion hung up the phone. She realized that everything in her life very soon and very abruptly changed. Not resenting fate, not expecting anything good from it, and yet not being angry at the world. Through suffering, pain, betrayals, and hardships, she finally waited for her bright streak. Alice woke up slowly. What's going on? Her mind raced. There was something hard against her back, and panic immediately made her heart race. Maybe this is still a dream, Alice thought, trying to remember what had happened before she came to her senses. And the new girl seemed to have woken up. Came the gruff voice of a woman in the distance. And you say dead? No. It's just a dream, Alice reassured herself. Just a nightmare that's about to dissipate, but the smells, the sounds that entered her nostrils and ears were too real for a nightmare. And I wonder where she was brought to us from. Came the voice again. Did a cutie like that manage to finish someone off? The voices were rough and unpleasant. Alice struggled to open her eyes and realized she was in a dingy cell. Not at a resort, said a woman sitting not far from Alice. Several gray-clad prisoners were sitting next to her, and the stare seemed no good. Alice felt fear engulf her entire being. She desperately didn't understand how she had ended up in this casemate. What are you looking at? One of the sitters threw angrily. Alice immediately jumped up, huddled in a corner, and tucked her legs under her. Her heart was racing, her eyes filled with terror. The people in the cell were clearly repeat offenders, with the marks of a hard life on their faces, and the fingers of their hands were littered with various tattoos. Oh, she's going to faint from fear again, one of the sitters grinned. I'm Barbara, muttered the recidivist sitting closest to Alice the Watcher. What's your name? Still dazed, Alice couldn't understand what was happening. Just yesterday she had been in the arms of her husband Daniel on one of Sunny Beach's beaches. Memories came to her like a flashed frame from a movie. Do you remember when we first met? Daniel asked then, smiling. Well, how could anyone forget that? You took me away from my own birthday party and drove me around town all night until it was time to meet the sunrise. Alice smiled. Their whole relationship had been just magical, unbelievable, like an adventure. But now the fairy tale had turned into a nightmare. Alice dreaded every minute spent in that gloomy cell. She was uncomfortable. She couldn't understand how she'd even ended up in this situation in the first place. Did you swallow your tongue? Barbara muttered angrily. The woman got up from her bunk, walked over to Alice and leaned over her threateningly. Talk about sewing someone up, Barbara hissed. Maybe you're too cool to talk to us. And my dear must have just forgotten her tongue on the outside, exclaimed the other. The unpleasant laughter and derogatory remarks of the cellmates made Alice feel even more afraid and helpless. She could feel the despair coursing through her soul. There were tears in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back, afraid to show her weakness. So what did you get raked up for? Barbara muttered. Tell me before you're driven under the bunkhouse. I'm sorry, Alice mumbled, then still tried to explain. I don't understand. Maybe you drank too much champagne at your fancy party, one of Barbara's companions hissed angrily. She stood up, picked up a mug from the table, and splashed Alice in the face with cold water. Alice shuddered, feeling the moisture spreading through her clothes. For what? What have I done? The desperation in her voice was growing with each passing second. Finally, Alice couldn't take it anymore and jumped up from her seat straight to the door. Beginning to pound on the steel-battered barrier, she screamed. Somebody open up. Alice pounded her fists on the cold surface. Suddenly, the small window in the center opened again, and the sleepy face of a guard appeared in the opening. "What do you want?" Scared, he asked gruffly. "Call the supervisor. I need to talk to him. There's some kind of mistake." "I'm not supposed to be here," Alice yelled. "Girl, you're in the wrong place to ask to see someone. Wait until morning. Maybe you'll get an explanation." Then the guard tossed indifferently. "Please, this is important. I need to get to the bottom of this situation. Call the supervisor. Please," Alice continued to plead with hope in her voice. The man only shook his head, maintaining a look of indifference on his face. "No one's going to make a request in the middle of the night for someone like you," the policeman muttered. "Frankly, if I were you, I wouldn't count on any response during the day either." Alice took a step back, clasping her hands to her chest. Feeling helpless inside, she was forced to accept the rejection. The metal flap slammed shut. The lock clinked. Sitting back in her seat, Alice felt the icy claws of fear clutching her heart. At no time in her life had she ever felt as insignificant as she did now. Alice tried to calm herself, but the fear and bewilderment would not leave her. She did not know how she had ended up in prison. Alice felt completely disconnected from reality. Barbara, who had taunted her earlier, came over and asked, "Are you really that stupid, or are you just pretending to be?" "No, I don't remember anything. I don't even know what date today is," Alice replied with despair in her voice. "July 18th, Barbara said with bewilderment. Alice felt a pang in her chest. It had been almost 2 days since she'd been in this nightmarish reality, and that knowledge only added to her sense of despair. "Who are you anyway?" Softening her voice, Barbara inquired. "It seems like just yesterday I married Daniel. We had a wedding on the beach. It was so beautiful, and today I wake up in this prison," Alice began to say. "Is that all you have to say?" Barbara raised an eyebrow skeptically. "My dad died recently, and he left me a pretty good inheritance. But that doesn't explain anything. I've been happy. We were doing well in my marriage to Daniel." Alice shook her head. Memories of her father made her soul feel sad. "I guess they said you killed someone," Barbara replied in a lowered voice. "What kind of nonsense is that?" "Who could I have killed?" Alice sighed sorrowfully. She felt an inner shock and panic. This realization terrified her, and she still couldn't believe the reality of what was happening. It didn't take long for morning to come. The scowling guard opened his window again, found Alice's gaze, and beckoned her over. "You're being summoned," he muttered when he saw the girl come to the door. "Warden?" Alice asked hopefully. She interjected. Face the wall. The guard swung the door open, pushed her against the nearest wall, turned her around, and clasped her hands painfully. "Let go!" Alice exclaimed with desperation in her voice. She felt the cold bracelets click on her wrist. The guard roughly took her under the elbow and pushed her out into the hallway. "Good morning, sweetheart." A man in an investigator's uniform smiled unpleasantly. "My name's John, the first investigating your case, but I wouldn't say I'm glad to meet you," Alice snorted. Her handcuffs were never removed, and Alice was forced to sit on the very edge of the uncomfortable chair. "Well, I'm sure you'll get used to our conditions," John smiled unpleasantly again. "Although perhaps you're ready to confess to your stepfather's death now. After all, you were the one who killed him." "What stepfather?" "My father died recently." "Who do you think I am?" Alice exclaimed in bewilderment. "Well, honey, you don't have to pretend like you don't know. Your fingerprints are at the crime scene, and your DNA evidence confirms your involvement." John tossed some opinion sheets onto the table, pointing to them with his hand in an inviting gesture. Alice rounded her eyes in horror. Her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. "What fingerprints? What does DNA have to do with it?" A panicked thought battered at the back of her mind. "That's impossible. I didn't kill anyone." "I don't even know what crime we're talking about," Alice whispered. "Of course you do, of course you do. We've got a whole lot of innocent people here," John nodded. "What's this then?" The investigator dug through the folder again, then showed Alice the crime scene photos. Some man was lying face down, with blood all around him and shrapnel lying on the floor near his body. "What does this man have to do with this?" Alice asked in a trembling voice. She could feel the ground slipping from under her feet, and the worry was weighing so heavily on her soul that it was about to tear her apart. "That's your business," John marveled. "I might as well be. But here the neighbors have absolutely pinpointed the culprit, and even made a sketch." The investigator pointed with his hand to a booth hanging to Alice's right. She turned and stared at her own image. The girl in the sketch looked exactly like her, except the first and last name were different. This is some kind of forgery. It can't be me. Alice felt everything inside her turn over with horror. This sketch was proof that she had something to do with the mysterious crime. Sweetheart, we found you on the seashore. You were lying there unconscious and had no identification on you. Your sketch matched the description given by the witnesses. Therefore, you are now a murder suspect, John said, savoring every word. So that's not my last name. I'm a completely different person. Go to my husband. He will tell you, Alice cried out in despair. We haven't seen any husband yet, he muttered doubtfully. We have, however, discovered a man's belongings on the shore. I suppose your spouse, if there was one, is in distress, either drowned himself or another victim of your criminal tendencies. Alice felt her whole body go numb. She couldn't believe Daniel could have gotten into danger. Ask someone else. My co-workers at work, relatives. But someone has to tell you what my real name is, and you'll even give those people's contacts yourself, she said. John raised an eyebrow skeptically. Yes, now. Alice, finding herself in a serious situation, began to frantically search her memory, trying to recall anyone who could confirm her identity and dispel any doubts that she was innocent. John watched her the whole time, enjoying the desperation of the suspect, but after a couple minutes he was clearly bored with the spectacle. Remember? The investigator inquired in a jumped-up tone. Just a minute. You don't have a minute, John bellowed. He leaned across the table, grabbed Alice by the hair and yanked hard, making her head whip from side to side. Quickly sign the confession. Get to the bunkhouse. I'm not going to be dealing with crap all day. Tears spurted from Alice's eyes. She cried out painfully, feeling the pain pierce her head and travel down her spine. The investigator continued to yell something and threaten, but now his voice sounded as if from far away. Helen, my subordinate at my father's firm, Alice said through sobs. What? John interjected angrily. Helen savage. She'll confirm that she knows me. The phone or something, not understanding, John interjected. Phone dictate. Stupid. The investigator let go of his hair. Alice sobbed a couple more times, then began confusedly dictating the right numbers. I'll call her. But if this is some kind of joke, you're going to be very sorry, John muttered angrily. Alice stared at the floor in pain and fear. The mind abstracted, preferring to ignore reality. Her gaze froze. After all, she wasn't capable of experiencing so much stress in such a short time, was she? Understand? No, John bellowed, giving Alice a whipping slap. Got it, Alice barely audibly whispered, feeling the blood begin to ooze from her busted lip. Several hours passed, which she spent like this in the investigator's office. Excuse me, Mr. Investigator. There's someone here to see you, came the voice of a guard from behind the door. What's going on here? The blonde shouted indignantly, throwing a lightning-fast glare in the investigator's direction as she barely crossed the threshold of his office. Ah, a friend of the suspect. I guess John shook his head indifferently. Yes, I've known Alice for a long time, and I have every confidence in her innocence. She is the daughter of my boss. And at the time this crime is alleged to have been committed, she was in a completely different location. We have witnesses, documents to prove her alibi, Helen spoke coldly. And we have proof, John parried stiffly. This is some kind of setup. Alice is innocent of anything, and no amount of fingerprints will help you wrangle 50 people who saw her in person at the negotiations on the day of the alleged murder. Alice listened to Helen and John's conversation with mixed feelings of anxiety and hope. At first, she had felt horror and anxiety as she listened to the investigator insist on her guilt and present the evidence. But with Helen's arrival and her confident words of innocence, hope rang within. I'm asking you to leave Alice alone, Helen said peremptorily. Otherwise, we'll have to get the press involved. No press, John retorted sourly. It seemed he had to admit that they simply didn't have enough grounds to accuse Alice. I'm sorry, I think there's been a mix-up, John said reluctantly. Turning to Alice, you may not be the only child in your family. There is a possibility that you had a twin sister. What twins? Alice interjected bitterly. But if you have any other ways to explain the devilishness going on in this case, I'm listening, the man muttered unhappily. A storm of feelings erupted inside Alice. She couldn't understand what this was about, or why there was suddenly information about twins. She felt her life falling apart and the footing going out from under her feet. Mixed feelings, confusion, bewilderment, fear, overwhelmed her. She realized that she needed to solve this puzzle to understand what was even going on in her life. Helen insisted that Alice be released immediately. Helen, do you know what happened to Daniel? Alice asked first thing. No one has seen him for the last few days, the assistant shrugged. Everyone thought you were on vacation after the wedding. The car began to pull away from the gloomy building. and anxiety grew more and more pronounced in Alice's heart. "Are you sure you can manage?" Helen asked doubtfully, looking at her superior. "Yes. Don't worry," Alice dismissed absent-mindedly. All her thoughts were now focused on the search. She ran into the house, literally flew up the second floor to her in her husband's bedroom, and embraced the sight, but there was only emptiness. "Where could you have disappeared to?" Alice muttered fearfully, looking through Daniel's things. Dialing a familiar number with trembling fingers, she put the phone to her ear, listening to the dial tone with bated breath. Come on," she whispered. It was all to no avail. The phone was silent, as was the empty bedroom, which was unable to clear up the monstrous situation one bit. Alice remembered again how they had planned to spend a romantic vacation on the beach. "Trust me, it's going to be awesome," Daniel said with a smile, showing her pictures of golden sand and azure sea. "We'll be all alone there," Alice said hesitantly, as if sensing trouble. "Well, that's just the opposite of great. Just imagine you, me, the sea, and no one else around. Isn't it a fairy tale?" A fairy tale. And if Alice had known how this ill-fated trip would turn out, she would never have agreed to this godforsaken place. "Hello, Bill, this is Daniel's wife. Hi, do you have any idea where Daniel might be right now?" she said, dialing the number of a fellow spouse they had met at the wedding. "Hi, I thought he was on a wedding trip with you," Bill replied doubtfully. "And we just missed each other." "Sorry to bother you," Alice said. "Is something wrong? Do you need help?" Bill muttered worriedly. "No, sorry, bye." Alice hung up the phone. Her inner feelings were at breaking point. Just out of desperation, Alice opened the message list on her phone, her eyes stumbling upon a text message from the DHS informing her that a major storm was coming. A chilling realization ran through her body. The words that had come almost a week ago never left her. A violent storm. The danger the meteorologists had warned of. Right, how could I have forgotten about the storm? They'd had to postpone the trip. But Daniel had insisted that no forecast of bad weather could interfere with their love. "Okay, I hope you're right," Alice said. Romance and carelessness mixed with champagne that day, and she did nothing to stop her husband. How could I forget that the meteorologists were predicting a major storm that day? We couldn't only give warning. It was our mistake, but reflection and self-deprecation brought no comfort. It was my fault. I should have convinced Daniel not to go ashore, and I remained silent. And now he's probably drowned because of me. Alice's voice trembled with guilt and hopelessness. She tried to hold back the tears, but still they rolled down her cheeks, leaving hot paths behind them. Her breath caught at the thought that she would never see Daniel again, that he might have died because of her own carelessness. "Daniel." "I'm sorry." Alice closed her eyes, trying to dull the pain, but she could feel the guilt pressing on her shoulders like a heavy weight that she must now carry alone. Alice grieved for a few days, but then determination and the desire to find out the truth took over. "I can't sit here in despair any longer," Alice exclaimed, feeling the walls of the empty bedroom literally suffocating her. "Daniel deserves for the truth to come out. I have to find out what happened that day." That being said, it was done. She began contacting people who could help her in this endeavor. One of them was Victor Palick, her late father's former partner. "Alice, I understand you. Losing loved ones is very painful," he said with compassion. "I've known you since you were in diapers, and I'm always ready to help. I have an acquaintance named Andrew. I think he can help with this case." "He'd want to work for me," Alice said doubtfully. "You see, he's got an expensive operation coming up that he doesn't have enough money for. If you're willing to pay well, the guy will get you the very devil out of the ground. Trust me, he's the best detective I know." "Yeah, I'm willing." "It's a small price to pay for the truth." Alice shook her head. "That's good." She clasped her hands to her chest. Feeling mixed emotions inside, Alice was willing to go to any lengths to find answers, even if it did require her to spend an unexpected amount of money. She met Andrew at a small cafe in the center of town. Alice gave him all the information she had on Daniel, directing him to search for him. But she decided to start on the other side, to find traces of her doppelganger. It remained to discuss a plan of action, which they did at a neat coffee shop table. "I understand the mission. We'll try to find Daniel, or at least find out what happened to him. But what do you need this doppelganger for?" Andrew asked, perplexed. "The investigator just decided to write off an unsolved case on you, so he made up a fairy tale. Is it worth your time? I think if I find it might shed some light on the whole story. Maybe she knows something or has something to do with what happened. We need to find out why I was mistaken for her, and how it's simultaneously connected to Daniel's disappearance," Alice reasoned. "Yeah, maybe there's no doppelganger at all." "What makes you think that's true?" Andrew said. "It's just, it's like a gut feeling that there's a string to pull." And it all happened in the same period of time. Alice's eyes read determination to find out everything and either find Daniel or mourn his ashes. Andrew nodded, realizing that was the logical course of action. Okay, let's start by looking for traces of your doppelganger. Perhaps her friends, co-workers, or even family can help. I'll work on that for now, while you continue your own search. And if you find anything, let me know. I think we can solve this mystery together. There's no need to despair before the time. Thank you, Alice whispered softly. Andrew's reassurance gave her strength, helped her shake off her troubles. Alice arrived in the quiet suburban neighborhood where her copy was said to be living with her stepfather. What a shithole, Alice muttered, deciding not to waste any time. She headed straight for the house, feeling a mixed sense of anxiety and determination. Finally, gone somewhere, the wretch. Left me and the kids and went away. And you didn't even tell us when you'd be back, the burly aunt blurted out as she stepped out into the stairwell. I'm sorry, you have me confused. I'm not who you thought I was, Alice said doubtfully. Shameless. Forgetting about your brood and driving off somewhere. So irresponsible, echoed the gaunt man. Alice tried to explain to them that they were wrong. It seemed the neighbors had mistaken her for a double. Wait a minute, I'm not Anna. You've got me confused. What are you talking about? Wailed the little man. Wait, yanked him back doubtfully by his aunt. There's something wrong. She's kind of frumpy, not at all like our catty. Exactly. And her features are softer and her eyes look different, the man muttered, immediately replacing anger with curiosity. My name is Greg, and this is my wife Irene, excuse me, but who is Katie and where is she now? Alice interjected. And she went away a long time ago. Left us with the kids. Didn't say when she'd be back. And didn't tell me anything at all, Greg grumbled resentfully. Yeah, you two seem to be a lot alike, like sisters. Katie lived here with her mom until she died. Her stepfather drank and abused her from childhood, Irene said in a lowered voice. And then he was found dead with a knife in his back. They suspect Katie killed him and ran away. I warned him not to torture a girl so much. Alice listened to the neighbors, feeling mixed emotions. She realized that she had a very mysterious story to tell, and she wanted to know more. The tale shocked her. It's unbelievable. I couldn't even imagine that I could have a sister. So where is she now? In a trembling voice, Alice asked again. Oh, we don't know, Irene shrugged. She was missing when the incident happened. The kids, 3 of them you can imagine, were put in an orphanage. Looking at her neighbor, Alice felt the bitter pain and simultaneous joy of knowing she might have a family, new relatives. Wow, Alice thought to herself. She sat in the car, staring at the orphanage where she was headed to see her nephews. The phone rang and she saw that it was Andrew, detective, who was helping her with the investigation. Hey, what's up? She said tiredly. I found some interesting information. It turns out that shortly before he was lost at sea, Daniel took out life insurance on his life for a substantial sum. The beneficiary of the insurance is listed as an unknown girl. Alice shuddered and pressed the phone harder against her ear. Her heart began to beat faster. How's that? Tell me more about it. I'm going to check for additional details, but it seems Daniel was able to insure his life for some ulterior purpose. It's kind of weird. I think we should find out who the girl is and why Daniel left her the insurance, Andrew said. Shock rippled through Alice's body. She was slowly realizing that her husband, her beloved and closest person, might have married her for some obscure purpose, only to die afterwards and leave the money to some unknown person. The thought seemed both absurd and eerie at the same time. I can't believe it. It's horrible. What kind of person would do such a thing? And who is she, this girl? We must certainly find out. Of course, I won't give up the search. Let's see this investigation through to the end. Andrew's voice began to get lost in the storm of emotions that such strange news left behind. Okay, sorry, I've got a case. I need to finish it. Need any help? I'm out of town. I think I can handle it. I'll be in touch if you need anything, Alice said. Andrew dropped the call. There was a short beep on the speaker. Alice entered the orphanage. 3 little kids of about 5 years old, playing in the hallway and unaware that their Aunt Alice had come to meet them, caught her eye. My heart sank. There was too much character in their faces, and they were similar to each other, giving away their origins. Hello, who are you here to see? The woman asked, smiling at Alice. You know, I have a strange request, Alice mumbled. At that moment, her heart beat harder. Alice wanted to make sure that she was really related to these children. Could you give me samples for DNA testing on these kids over here, Alice said, pointing to her nephews. I don't know what you mean, the woman frowned. I recently found out that I might be related to them. and I'd like to run a test. If it turns out to be correct, I can take the children, can't I?" Alice could feel the excitement twisting everything inside. When she had come to the clinic to have the DNA test done to confirm her parentage, the doctor had immediately warned her that she would have to wait. "And how could it even come to this?" Alice muttered, rubbing her palms together nervously. She waited for the results of the tests with hope and fear, which was already habitually present in her life, only changing its appearance from time to time. Finally, the result was ready. "Well, here are your tests," the lab technician said, holding out an envelope. "The result is positive. Congratulations, or is it sympathy? I don't know what your reason for doing this test was." Listening to his words, Alice shook with excitement. She slowly opened the form and carefully read the small lines. Soon she was back in the orphanage director's office, holding the papers with the results. Her heart was beating harder than ever. "Hello, Alice Wright. What a familiar face you have. What can I do for you?" the principal asked. "Yes, that's right. I came back with the results of the DNA test. The children that were given to you a while ago are my nephews. The test confirmed the parentage," replied Alice. The principal was stunned by the news, but then his face suddenly lit up with memories, as if he finally realized why she seemed familiar. "You know, I have a great memory for alumni," the principal said cryptically. "But age, I repent. It's only just now dawned on me." "Why? It seems as if I've seen you before," Alice marveled. "Really, yes, I remember that girl and their mother, and you when you were barely older than your nephews. You were sisters, and then you were separated as infants. But not me. I was working as a caretaker at the time, and had no influence on anything." Once again, Alice felt her heart clench at the truth that had been revealed. Just like that, a phrase dropped so easily it completely shattered the life she was used to. "Yeah, it's weird. I was sure that I was my parents' own daughter, and now I realize that I always felt something was wrong." Tears came to her eyes. Trying to save face, Alice furtively wiped them from the corners of her eyes, but the gesture didn't escape the principal's notice. "This is a difficult moment, but it's also a chance to be reunited with your family. I hope you can help them once things are settled," he said. Alice felt joy, but also fear and uncertainty about the future. But she knew she now had a purpose to be who she really was and to take care of her real family. After a very long time, Alice returned to the principal's office once again. His name was Christopher Valentine, and this time they had time to get to know each other properly. "It wasn't easy. I spent a week trying to get all the right papers together, going through a lot of restrictions and red tape. But when I saw their smiles, when they saw me for the first time, all the difficulties turned out to be for naught," Alice said softly. Christopher Valentine looked at the newfound guardian of 3 little ones with a smile and nodded at her. "You know, no hardship can compare to the joy you have brought to these children and their smiles, a reward for your selfless care." Alice smiled and sighed. "Thank you, Christopher Valentine. I must do everything in my power to provide them with a better future." The joy of motherhood, unavailable to Alice before, colored her life with pleasant colors. However, the shadow of the unknown still lay over the story of Daniel and missing Katie. Alice met Andrew at the cafe to discuss the results of his investigations. "Well, did you find anything new?" Alice asked. Barely had he crossed the threshold of the coffee shop. "Yes. Alice, I found the name of the girl who was supposed to be paid the insurance money on Daniel's policy. Her name is Lucy Crawford," Andrew replied. Alice paled slightly when she heard the name. She had heard it before, hadn't she? Lucy Crawford. Turns out Lucy worked as a secretary in the department of your company that Daniel headed. It turns out my little investigation uncovered a little more curious details." "What curious details?" Alice asked. Andrew's words left Alice perplexed and alarmed. Why would the secretary receive an insurance payout after his death? Why not me or his relatives, she thought. "I think a little." "Alice, you're not a stupid woman." Andrew shook his head. "Of course, we don't know all the details, but from all appearances, there was an affair between her and Daniel. That relationship could have gone very far and apparently led to something bad." Alice froze, trying not to breathe. It seemed that one careless movement, and she would crumble. The secretary's affair with her husband, the insurance policy, all pointed to the fact that she might have been involved in his death. Maybe she's the killer? Alice's mind flashed. She leaned back in her chair. A heavy feeling of disappointment and loss came over her. Alice picked up her briefcase, looked up, and headed in the direction of human resources. She hoped to find out how to contact Lucy Crawford so she could locate her and get to the bottom of this situation. "Hello, I'm looking for information on an employee of Lucy's. I need to get in touch with her," Alice said. When the human resources manager came out to her, she looked at Alice with surprise and then smiled. "Lucy Crawford? You mean the former employee? I mean, she quit just a day ago, decided to move to another company. He didn't even do her 2 weeks. I don't know who her patron is," the manager replied. Alice was shocked. Why did she quit? Where does she work now? That's the thing. Moved to our competitors after leaving her application just a day ago. Said they offered her more favorable terms, but it's strange that she left so suddenly. Alice realized that her target had slipped away at the last moment. She needed to find Lucy and find out the truth, but that was proving more difficult than she had expected. Andrew didn't call until a few days later, when Alice was finally desperate to find anything. "Alice, I've managed to track Lucy down, and I have good news," Andrew announced from the doorstep. Months of investigation and constant communication had melted the ice between them. Now they were a little closer than just colleagues. Andrew even caught himself thinking that Alice sympathized with him as a woman, but he wasn't in a hurry to give in to his feelings. "What is it? Tell me already," Alice said impatiently. "It turns out that Daniel is alive." Andrew immediately stunned her, and he was closer than you think. Not far away at all, in a cabin in the woods, almost near the edge of your town. Alice felt a whole wave of feelings. When Andrew had informed her that Daniel was hiding near their house, at first it had been surprise how was that even possible, then relief at the thought that her husband was still alive. However, that was quickly replaced by other dark emotions. "I didn't want to bother you right away. That's why I called the police to begin with," Andrew continued cautiously. "What, they detained him? Why did you decide that without me?" "I just did my job," Andrew shrugged. "I didn't piss you off for helping me find the truth, not to put my husband behind bars. That's what interrogations are for, among other things, to find the truth." "I'm sorry, Alice, but Daniel confessed to everything." Andrew shook his head regretfully. "To everything he said. Told me that his intentions were unfair to you. He knew the code to your safe and was going to rob the house, just waiting for the right time." "Ah, I can't believe it. He was willing to do that in his own house." As Alice realized the news about Daniel, her soul filled with a mixture of grief, disappointment, and a sense of betrayal that expressed itself in tears on her cheeks. "Yes, that's exactly right. But thanks to the quick work of the police officers, we were able to thwart his plans. He repented and signed a clean confession." Andrew tried to support his friend. "Yeah, it's hard to digest," Alice muttered, looking down at the floor. "We've been through so much already. Now this. But I guess the important thing is that he's alive and will be punished for his actions. Yeah, it's not your fault he turned out to be a criminal. A fake death for insurance for a mistress. A robbery. He didn't deserve all that. But at least Daniel can't do any more harm. That must be hard. But you have to remember, you have those who are there to support you at any time." "Thank you, Andrew. You've done so much," Alice whispered, shaking her head. "Always happy to help. You're a strong woman. You're sure to get through this." Tears rolled down her cheeks, leaving salty trails. After Daniel's capture, the days stretched on. Andrew had offered to arrange a date with her ex-husband, but Alice had refused, not wanting to see the unhappy traitor. Now she wanted to concentrate on getting on with her life and regaining some semblance of footing. One day, Alice decided to call the office to see if everything was all right. Helen, as usual, answered her call in a businesslike manner, but the conversation suddenly descended into strange happenings. "Alice, how are you?" "We've been worried about you," Helen said. "Thank you. Yes, more or less. But we need to move on somehow. I understand we haven't worried you, but do you know about Lucy yet?" "What happened to her?" Alice was wary. An ominous foreboding settled in her soul. "Turns out she just betrayed Daniel, and it looks like she started gathering some dirt on her new bosses," Helen said. "They fired her, set up an internal investigation, and then concluded that she was involved in insurance fraud. So Lucy ended up in jail too, just like your ex-spouse. It's kind of a nightmare. All the seemingly familiar people have turned out to be crooks. I feel like my life has changed irrevocably." Alice realized that she needed to move on despite all the obstacles, but she was too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. In a big cozy house surrounded by greenery and flowers, she took care of her family, setting up house for the children, building place and play and learn. These boys were like her own children to her now. She did her best to make their lives happy and carefree. The little ones, barely learning to talk, were full of energy and questions. Alice taught them by playing interesting educational games and helped them explore the world around them. In the evenings, they gathered together in the living room. Alice read stories before bedtime. After a while, Alice and Andrew stayed in a small room after the operation. There was silence, and both realized that they now had a chance to talk alone. "Thank you, Alice, for finding the strength to talk me into this examination. I didn't think I'd ever walk normally." "You're a brave man," Andrew said. "You've overcome so much in life." "I was sure you could do it," Alice replied. "But I have to say, I couldn't have done it without your support. You've always been there for me. And I'm very grateful for that." Andrew smiled softly. "Friends are supposed to help each other through the hardest moments." Alice smiled back timidly. "I want you to know how grateful I am to you. I mean, you literally changed my life," Andrew said. "And you changed mine too," Alice replied. Their eyes met, and in that moment, words became superfluous. Smiles of happiness and gratitude played on their faces. They knew they now had their whole lives to share together. The hospital room was filled with soft light streaming in through the half-closed curtains. Andrew lay on the bunk while Alice sat next to him, holding his hand in hers. It was at that moment that they realized something had changed between them. Alice, I feel like I've gotten to know you better than I ever have. You're so caring, so kind, Andrew said. It's been mutual. You were the only one who stayed by my side when things were hard for me, Alice replied. Their hands began to squeeze each other tighter. Andrew, the moment our eyes meet, I realize that I feel something more than friendship for you. I like you, Alice whispered, desperately embarrassed. Her heart pounded in her chest, making her whole body tremble with excitement and fear. She had decided to take this step, no matter what, because she wanted to be honest with herself and with the man she could love. Me too, Alice, I can't imagine my life without you. You fill my heart with warmth and happiness, Andrew replied. They drew closer to each other and their lips joined in a tender kiss that was full of feeling and promise. Their love, which had arisen at the most inopportune moment, turned out to be real and strong, ready to cope with any difficulty. Katie's babies had long since grown accustomed to Alice's home and were an endless source of joy and laughter for their new caring mom. She hired a nanny for them, who took care of the children in her absence. But as it happens, even the most caring nanny didn't always have time for everything, especially considering the 3 active toddlers. Recently, the children started talking about something strange. They claimed to have seen their mom when no one was home. This woman was sad, but always read them stories, talked and comforted them. They said that Katie would come to them in their room. That sounds kind of weird. I think you should seek medical help, consult some doctor, although it could just be a childish fantasy. But yes, Andrew, you're right. We can't let this go unchecked. These are my children, and I don't want them to be threatened by anything, Alice said. At first, she thought it was just a fantasy, but as time went on, she began to notice strange things. Food was disappearing from the refrigerator. Things were moving around, and she felt like someone was watching her. This caused her anxiety and even some fear. Andrew moved into Alice's house, and together they decided to start solving the mysterious incidents that were happening to the children. They set up cameras in the house, hoping to record anything that might explain the children's strange stories. Andrew went on duty. He stayed up nights studying the camera footage and waiting for any unusual events to occur, but the long nights passed without any sign of any obvious manifestations of mysticism. He began to think more and more often that the children were badly mistaken, and perhaps this was just a figment of their imagination. A few days later, when everyone had decided that the children had simply made up the story and the night watch had been lifted, the little ones again said that Mommy was coming. This conversation caused Alice and Andrew to turn on the video cameras again, and their attention was drawn to the screen. Do you see this? She comes at night to see the kids. It's really catty, my sister Alice exhaled excitedly. I wonder what made her come back after all these months. I don't know, maybe she sensed the boys were in danger, or maybe she needs to pass something on. Let's find a way to contact her. Figure it out. But she comes on her own. Just waiting for another visit is enough, Andrew shrugged. Yeah, we can't miss the chance to find out the truth. Why she's back and where she's been disappearing to in the first place, Alice agreed. And then one night they finally had their luck. Katie sneaked back into the house, thinking everyone was asleep. But Andrew and Alice were ready, meeting her right in the hallway. Katie, hello there. We need some answers. Why are you coming back like a thief now? Alice asked. Yeah, I come to see them, to be closer to them. But I didn't hurt anyone, replied the guest fearfully. We've seen the camera footage, and we know you come when everyone is already asleep. Why all the secrecy? Andrew frowned. Please understand me. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to be around the kids, replied Katie. Then why did you disappear? We all thought you were in trouble or dead. What happened? Alice asked, softening her voice a little. A man owed a lot of money, began Katie explaining. And when he realized he didn't have it, he decided to bail me out, said he didn't need me anymore. But I guess they weren't happy with that exchange, Andrew said. No, Katie shook her head sadly. They killed him, and then they came after me as a witness. A confused but determined Alice walked over to her sister, who was shuffling nervously from foot to foot at the door. Katie, I'm sorry you've been through all this. We can help you, but you need to cooperate with us. Turn yourself in to the police. Running away is not the answer. Let's talk about how we can do this so you can be exonerated. You don't understand. I didn't kill my stepfather. It was his drinking buddies. They were behind the horror, Katie said with tears in her eyes. I believe you. We'll get a good lawyer. Yes, Katie, I know a good one. He's a real professional. He'll work on your case and prove that you're innocent. All we need is your consent to find out, Andrew said confidently. Do you think it'll work? Katie asked hopefully. Absolutely, Alice nodded. We won't leave you in the lurch. We're family. Katie, still covered in tears, hesitated at first, but then she took a deep breath and nodded firmly. I don't want to run and hide anymore, she said. The police and Andrew breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that they were on the right track. Alice put her arms around her sister and stroked her back, comforting her. It's the right thing to do. Katie will be by your side every step of the way. While Katie provided information to the lawyer, Andrew, like a true detective, continued his investigation. He checked all available evidence, conducted interviews, and soon conclusive evidence was found that Katie was innocent. Alice and Andrew supported her. They came to see her when she was in custody, discussed plans with her lawyer, and were always there to support her morally. Every look, every gesture said that they believed in her innocence, and finally the big day arrived. In court, all the evidence prepared by Andrew was presented, and after much debate, the court announced the verdict. Katie, you are acquitted. Your innocence has been recognized by the court. You are hereby acquitted of all charges. Alice, Andrew, and Katie hugged each other joyfully. Tears of happiness came from all three of them, and it united them even more. Sitting in her cozy home, Alice decided to share some important news with her lover. Her heart was full of joy. She believed that Andrew would share her happiness, although she was a little apprehensive. "Andrew, I'm pregnant," Alice breathed out and stood waiting. "Alice, I love you very much," Andrew replied. They embraced, knowing that their future would be filled with joy and happiness. "I'm sorry to interrupt." Barbara suddenly interrupted their unity. Yes, is something wrong?" Alice and Andrew were immediately alarmed. "No, I mean with the children." Barbara lowered her gaze. "What is it?" Andrew intervened. "Alice, I'm sorry for reacting so emotionally. When I saw that mark on Katie's arm, it just shocked me. What's wrong? Why are you so worried? I saw the birthmark today. And it's exactly like the one on my daughter that I gave birth to many years ago. Are you sure?" Andrew questioned warily, shifting his gaze from his nanny to his lover. "Yes, that's for sure. I gave birth to 2 twin girls many years ago. I've long despaired of meeting them, but now with this mole, I have my eye on Alice." Alice felt her heart begin to beat more frequently. The conversation was too exciting not to affect her, but Alice was hardly prepared for the turmoil Valentina wanted to unleash on her. Sobbing but looking at the young people, she decided to share what had long weighed on her soul. Bitter memories came to the surface, and she began to tell her story. "A long time ago, when you, Katie, were just born, my husband met me at the maternity hospital," Nanny said bitterly. "He was so happy, so joyful, so full of hope, but everything changed very quickly. It was like he turned out to be someone I didn't know. When he found out you were born, he started celebrating with his friends. One day another, and then he just went on a bender, and suddenly our whole life was nothing but fear and violence." Alice listened with a shudder, realizing that this horror story was actually a chronicle of her real family. It was frightening to even imagine how much her mother had to endure. It was as if the weight of having children had changed him. He became more dangerous and tougher. "He drank, beat me, disappeared nights unknown," where Valentina continued in a trembling voice. "One day, in one of the worst moments, I grabbed a knife. It was all over. I don't remember how it happened, but I did it. I ended up being arrested and sent to jail. You went through such horrors, and it's all because of us," Alice whispered sadly. "No, it had nothing to do with the girls." Valentina tried to calm herself. "I lost my freedom, and you ended up in the little house, and then in the orphanage. All these years I searched for you, but the traces were lost. You ended up in a rich family, and Katie stayed poor. So I'm the bad mother, since I couldn't keep you from all those horrors." Alice hugged Valentina, trying to comfort her mother, who had experienced so much suffering and loss. "I can't imagine how much suffering you've been through. But we're together now. It's all in the past, thank you. Alice, I hope nothing can ever keep us apart again. I'm sorry. I overheard you," came Katie's voice suddenly. She had been standing in the doorway all this time, leaning her shoulder against the jamb. "Well, come to us quickly," then exclaimed Alice. The women gathered in the parlor to talk about what had happened. It was necessary to reveal the cards to the end, so that no more secrets should poison the life of their family. Katie looked very depressed, but was finally ready to tell her story too. "I met my baby's father back in high school. We were classmates and started dating after graduation when he left for the army. I waited for him to come back. He came back. We got married. He became a trucker, and one day there was a terrible accident. He was gone." "Katie, I can't even imagine what you've been through," Alice said bitterly. "Yes, after he died, I lost the meaning of life, thought it was better to die. But my children, my little ones, they saved me from that terrible mistake. I realized that they were the only thing I had left in this world, and I did everything I could to protect them and give them a good future. Yes, you are very strong, but now we can take care of our loved ones together. Since fate has brought us together, I'm sure," Alice said, "we'll be together and we'll be fine. Yes, Katie, we'll support you. You're not alone anymore. You have both your sister and your mom, and we'll do anything to help each other." Barbara hugged her daughter gently. Many tears were shed that day, but in the end, the family came together and a future filled with hope and love awaited them.